The Necrontyr civilization arose on worlds, bathed in the killing light of hyperactive stars, their home systems dominated by radiation-spewing suns that turned existence itself into an endurance test. These were not gentle yellow stars like those that nurture verdant worlds, but malevolent cosmic furnaces that bombarded their planets with lethal doses of hard radiation. The Necrontyr evolved under this constant assault, their biology shaped by an environment that seemed designed to inflict suffering. From birth to death, every Necrontyr carried the mark of their poison suns in their flesh, tumors grew with horrifying regularity, cancers bloomed in their organs, and cellular degradation was not a matter of if but when. The average Necrontyr lifespan rarely exceeded 4 decades, and those who managed to survive that long bore bodies ravaged by disease. Their skin became mottled with lesions, their bones grew brittle from radiation damage, and internal organs failed with depressing frequency. Medical technology could extend life somewhat, but it could not grant true health. The Necrontyr existed in a state of perpetual decline, watching their bodies betray them piece by piece. Children knew they would not see old age. Parents buried their offspring with grim regularity. This was not living, it was a slow march toward inevitable death, and the Necrontyr felt every agonizing step. This biological curse defined their entire civilization. Where other races might have developed philosophies of acceptance or spiritual transcendence, the Necrontyr cultivated bitterness. Their culture became obsessed with legacy, with making their mark before the cancer took them. They built monuments that would outlast their fragile flesh, erected structures of metal and stone that defied the radiation that destroyed organic matter. Their architecture reflected this obsession, massive pylons and obelisks of dark metal, inscribed with the names and deeds of those who had already succumbed to their inevitable fates. Every city was part necropolis, every achievement shadowed by mortality. The discovery of the Old Ones changed everything. These ancient beings possessed something the Necrontyr could never achieve through their own means: immortality. The Old Ones had existed for millions of years, their mastery of biological manipulation allowing them to extend their lives indefinitely. They moved through the galaxy with the confidence of beings who had all the time in existence to pursue their goals. To the Necrontyr, dying by inches in their radiation-blasted cities, this was an obscenity. Why should these creatures possess eternal life while the Necrontyr suffered and died? The envy that took root in Necrontyr society was not mere jealousy, it was an all-consuming rage at the cosmic injustice of their existence. The Necrontyr political structure reflected their need for unity in the face of their shared suffering. At the apex stood the Silent King, the supreme ruler whose authority was absolute. The title was not merely ceremonial. The Silent King held genuine power over all Necrontyr, his word carrying the weight of law across their entire empire. Below him sat the Triarch, a council of 3 powerful advisors who helped guide policy and coordinate the vast machinery of state. This triumvirate structure ensured that no single voice besides the Silent Kings could dominate policy, creating a system of checks and balances that prevented any one faction from seizing total control. Beneath this central authority sprawled the dynastic nobility, powerful families who controlled vast territories and commanded their own military forces. These dynasties were not merely administrative divisions, they were power bases unto themselves, each with its own traditions, military doctrines, and ambitions. The dynasties competed constantly for prestige and resources, their rivalries barely contained by the authority of the Silent King. Pharaon ruled over entire sectors, Nemessers commanded fleets and armies, and overlords governed individual worlds with iron fists. This competitive structure drove technological advancement and military excellence, but it also created fractures that would later prove catastrophic. The dynastic legions were formidable forces, vast armies equipped with weapons that represented the pinnacle of Necrontyr technological achievement. Each dynasty maintained its own military traditions, its own tactical doctrines, and its own heraldry. Some specialized in massed infantry assaults, others in swift mechanized warfare. The legions drilled constantly, preparing for conflicts that might come from rival dynasties or external threats. Officers rose through merit and political connections in equal measure, creating a military culture that valued both competence and loyalty to one's dynasty above all else. Despite their short lifespans, the Necrontyr achieved technological wonders that placed them among the galaxy's most advanced civilizations. Their scientists and engineers, driven by the desperate need to accomplish something lasting before death claimed them, pushed the boundaries of physical law. The Necrontyr developed Gauss technology, weapons that could strip matter apart at the atomic level. These weapons did not simply destroy targets. They flayed them layer by layer, molecular bonds breaking under precisely calibrated energy fields. A Gauss weapon could reduce a living being to its component atoms in seconds, or strip the armor from a war machine like peeling fruit. The green energy discharge of Gauss weaponry became the signature of Necrontyr military might. Their mastery of physics extended to propulsion systems that defied conventional understanding. Necrontyr ships employed inertialess drives, engines that allowed vessels to accelerate without experiencing the crushing forces that would normally accompany such movement. These drives manipulated the relationship between mass and acceleration itself, creating bubbles of altered physics around Necrontyr vessels. Ships could perform maneuvers that would pulverize crews using conventional drives, changing direction instantaneously or accelerating to incredible velocities without the need for gradual acceleration curves. This gave Necrontyr fleets tactical flexibility that few other races could match. Their weapons technology extended far beyond Gauss flares and rifles. Necrontyr scientists developed particle projectors that could superheat matter to stellar temperatures, weapons that manipulated fundamental forces to crush targets under impossible gravitational stress, and devices that could phase matter partially out of reality. They built war machines that towered over battlefields, constructs of living metal that could repair themselves even as enemy fire tore through their frames. The Necrontyr approach to warfare was methodical and devastating. They did not seek glorious victory, but total annihilation of their enemies. Yet for all their technological prowess, the Necrontyr remained mortal. Their weapons could strip atoms and their ships could cross the void, but they could not cure the cancers that grew in their bodies or extend their pitiful lifespans. This fundamental limitation ate at them, a constant reminder that their achievements would die with them. The Old Ones possessed the secret to immortality, the biological mastery that could grant the Necrontyr what they desperately craved. When diplomatic overtures failed, when the Old Ones refused to share their secrets of life extension, the Necrontyr made a decision that would reshape the galaxy. They went to war. The wars in heaven began with Necrontyr confidence. Their fleets were powerful, their weapons devastating, and their determination absolute. Surely the Old Ones, for all their biological mastery, could not stand against the full might of the Necrontyr Empire. The first engagement seemed to confirm this assessment. Necrontyr fleets struck at Old One holdings, their Gauss weapons and advanced technology overwhelming local defenses. Worlds fell to Necrontyr invasion forces, their armies methodically crushing resistance with the same precision they applied to all their endeavors. But the Old Ones possessed advantages that Necrontyr technology could not overcome. The ancient race had created the webway, a network of tunnels through an alternate dimension that connected distant points in real space. This was not simply faster than light travel, it was a strategic asset beyond price. Old One forces could appear anywhere in the galaxy without warning, strike at Necrontyr positions, and vanish before reinforcements arrived. The Necrontyr, despite their inertialess drives, were forced to travel through real space, their movements predictable and slow compared to the instantaneous repositioning the webway allowed. The Old Ones wielded psychic powers that the Necrontyr could barely comprehend, let alone counter. These were not the crude mental abilities of lesser races, but reality warping powers refined over millions of years. Old One Psychers could tear open space itself, summon energies that defied physical law, and manipulate matter with thought alone. Necrontyr soldiers found themselves facing enemies who could kill with a gesture, who could turn weapons against their wielders, who could see attacks coming before they were launched. The Necrontyr had built their civilization on technology and physical law. The Old Ones operated on principles that made such limitations irrelevant. Battle after battle ended in Necrontyr defeat. Their fleets would arrive at target systems, only to find them already evacuated through the webway. Their armies would establish beachheads on worlds, only to face Old One counterattacks that appeared from nowhere. The Necrontyr advantage in weapons technology meant nothing when they could not bring those weapons to bear effectively. The Old Ones fought a war of maneuver and misdirection, using their superior strategic mobility to negate every Necrontyr advantage. Necrontyr commanders, trained in conventional warfare, found themselves outmaneuvered at every turn by an enemy who refused to fight on their terms. The losses mounted. Entire fleets vanished into ambushes coordinated through the webway. Armies were stranded on worlds as Old One forces destroyed their supply lines with surgical precision. The Necrontyr threw more resources into the conflict. The competing dynasties temporarily united in their hatred of the Old Ones, but it made no difference. The technological superiority they had counted on proved worthless against an enemy who could simply avoid direct confrontation until conditions favored them. The wars in heaven ground on, consuming Necrontyr lives at an appalling rate, though given their short lifespans, perhaps the war merely accelerated what the radiation would have accomplished anyway. The Necrontyr Empire began to fracture under the strain. Dynasties that had unified against the Old Ones started questioning the strategy, the leadership, the very purpose of a war they seemed incapable of winning. The Silent King's authority held, but the cracks were forming. The Necrontyr had gone to war to claim immortality, to seize from the Old Ones what had been denied them. Instead, they were dying faster than ever, their already brief lives cut even shorter by a conflict they could not win. The bitterness that had always defined Necrontyr existence deepened into something darker, a desperation that would make them vulnerable to an offer that promised everything they desired and would cost them more than they could possibly imagine. The Necrontyr defeat seemed inevitable. Their fleets limped back to port with casualties they could barely replace. Their armies bled out on distant worlds for no strategic gain, and the Old Ones continued to outmaneuver them through the cursed webway. The Silent King, Zarek, watched his empire's military might grind itself to dust against an enemy that refused to die. The dynastic courts whispered of failure, of the futility of continuing a war that consumed resources and lives without bringing the Necrontyr any closer to their goal. Some dynasties began to withdraw their forces, prioritizing their own territorial holdings over the collective war effort. The unity that had briefly held the fractious Necrontyr together was dissolving, and with it, any hope of victory against the Old Ones. Then the Necrontyr astronomers detected something that would change everything. Deep space monitoring stations registered anomalous energy signatures near dying stars, patterns that suggested intelligence rather than natural stellar phenomena. The readings defied conventional analysis. These were not ships or conventional energy emissions, but something else entirely. Necrontyr scientists dispatched research vessels to investigate, their instruments detecting massive concentrations of energy that seemed to feed directly on stellar radiation. These entities existed in the void between stars, vast consciousnesses of pure energy that had drifted through space since the galaxy's formation. The Necrontyr called them Khatan, the star gods. These beings were older than any civilization, older than most stars themselves. They had no physical form in any conventional sense. They were sentient patterns of electromagnetic energy, vast and alien intellects that experienced reality in ways biological beings could never comprehend. The Khatan fed on the radiation of stars, absorbing energy directly from stellar emissions. They moved through space like predators through hunting grounds, seeking out young, energetic stars that could sustain their endless hunger. To the Necrontyr, watching these entities through their instruments, they appeared as gods made manifest. The Khatan were not a unified species. Each was an individual entity, separate and distinct, with its own personality and appetites. The Necrontyr made contact with several of these star gods, learning their natures through careful observation and cautious interaction. Azagorod, who would become known as the Nightbringer, fed on the terror and death of living beings, though the Necrontyr did not yet understand this aspect of its appetite. Mephetron, the Deceiver, possessed an intellect that delighted in manipulation and falsehood, seeing truth as merely one option among many. Magladroth, the Void Dragon, demonstrated an affinity for technology and the material universe that set it apart from its kin. The Necrontyr began to worship these entities. Here, finally, were beings that transcended the physical limitations that had cursed the Necrontyr since their evolution under radiation-poisoned suns. The Catan did not age, did not sicken, did not die. They existed in a state of perpetual being, their energy patterned self-sustaining across millions of years. To a race that watched their bodies decay before reaching middle age, the Catan represented everything they aspired to become. Temples were constructed to honor the star gods, rituals were developed to venerate them, and the Necrontyr priesthood grew in power and influence as intermediaries between mortal and divine. But Zarek saw beyond worship. The Silent King was a pragmatist, a ruler who had guided his fractious empire through centuries of internal strife and external war. He recognized that the Catan possessed power that could shift the balance against the Old Ones, but he also understood that gods rarely granted miracles without price. The Catan were intelligent, capable of communication, and clearly interested in the Necrontyr, though the reasons for that interest remained unclear. Zarek began to negotiate with the star gods, particularly with Mephitron, whose facility with language and concepts made it the most accessible of its kind. The Deceiver spoke to Zarek of transformation. The Catan had observed the Necrontyr's war against the Old Ones, had watched this dying race throw itself against an enemy it could not defeat. The star gods offered a solution. They could grant the Necrontyr immortality, could transfer their consciousness into bodies that would never age, never sicken, never die. These bodies would be constructed from living metal, a material called necrodermis that could repair itself, that could withstand damage, that would destroy organic tissue, that would endure across millennia without degradation. The Necrontyr would become like the Catan themselves, eternal beings free from the curse of their poisoned flesh. The price was steep. The Catan wanted the essence of the Necrontyr themselves, the vital energy that animated their bodies. The star gods had fed on stellar radiation for eons, but they had discovered something far more nourishing, the life force of sentient beings. This was not the soul as understood by those who would later study the warp. It was something more fundamental, the animating principle that separated living matter from dead. The Catan craved this energy with an hunger that dwarfed their appetite for stellar emissions. They offered the Necrontyr eternal life in metal bodies, and in exchange, they would consume the essence that made the Necrontyr alive. Zarek faced an impossible choice. His people were losing the war against the Old Ones. The Empire was fracturing as dynasties withdrew from the conflict. The Necrontyr were dying as they had always died, young, bitter, and full of rage at the injustice of their existence. The Catan offered a way out, a path to the immortality the Necrontyr had gone to war to claim. But the cost was everything that made them living beings, the intangible quality that separated consciousness from mere computation. The Silent King consulted with the Triarch, debated with his advisors, and considered the alternatives. There were none. The Necrontyr could accept the Catan's bargain, or they could continue their slow extinction under poisoned suns while losing a war against immortal enemies. Zarek agreed to the compact. The decision was his alone. The Silent King's authority was absolute, and he exercised it to bind his entire species to a fate they did not fully understand. The Catan were delighted. They had hungered for the essence of living beings, and now an entire civilization was offering itself up for consumption. The star gods set to work, collaborating with Necrontyr scientists to design the technology that would make biotransference possible. The Catan provided knowledge of energy manipulation that went beyond anything the Necrontyr had achieved. Together, they constructed vast machines that would strip consciousness from organic bodies and imprint it onto necrodermis frames. The process was called biotransference. Massive facilities were built on Necrontyr worlds, enormous structures that could process millions of individuals simultaneously. The necrodermis bodies were manufactured in quantities that staggered comprehension, billions of metal forms, each designed to house a Necrontyr consciousness. These were not crude mechanical bodies, but sophisticated constructs that mimicked the general shape of Necrontyr physiology while improving on it. The metal was self-repairing, capable of reconstituting itself even from catastrophic damage. The bodies were stronger than flesh, faster, and immune to the radiation that had plagued the Necrontyr since their evolution. The Necrontyr entered the biotransference facilities in their millions. They walked into the great machines as living beings, flesh and blood and bone, and they emerged as something else entirely. The process was instantaneous from an external perspective. Bodies entered one end of the machines, and metal forms emerged from the other. But for the individuals undergoing biotransference, the experience was an eternity of horror compressed into a single moment. The machines stripped away their organic forms layer by layer, translating neural patterns into energy matrices that were then imprinted onto necrodermis bodies. And as the flesh fell away, the Khatan fed. The essence of each Necrontyr, the vital spark that animated their consciousness, was consumed by the star gods. This was not a soul departing into the warp, as would happen with other races upon death. The Necrontyr had never possessed strong psychic potential, their connection to the immaterium minimal compared to races like the Old Ones. What the Khatan consumed was something more fundamental, the quality that made consciousness more than mere information processing, the intangible element that created genuine experience rather than simulation. The star gods gorged themselves on this feast, absorbing the life force of billions and growing stronger with each feeding. The Necrontyr who emerged from biotransference were no longer truly alive. They possessed their memories, their knowledge, their personalities in a technical sense, but something essential was missing. They could think, could reason, could make decisions, but they could not feel. The metal bodies had no nerve endings, no sensory organs in any biological sense. They experienced the universe through mechanical sensors that provided data but not sensation. They could detect temperature but not feel warmth or cold. They could register damage to their bodies but felt no pain. They could observe beauty but experienced no aesthetic response. They were consciousness without experience, minds trapped in shells that processed information without generating genuine sensation. The emotional impact was worse than the sensory deprivation. The Necrontyr had been a passionate people, driven by rage at their mortality, by envy of the Old Ones, by the desperate need to accomplish something lasting before death claimed them. These emotions had defined their civilization, had motivated their achievements and their wars. In their new forms, these feelings were gone. They retained the memory of emotion, could recall what anger or joy or fear had felt like, but they could no longer experience these states. They were hollow, consciousness operating in a void where feeling should have existed. They could recognize that they should be horrified by their transformation, could understand intellectually that something precious had been lost, but they could not actually feel that horror. The realization of what had been done to them spread through the newly transformed Necrons like a virus through a network. They had traded their dying flesh for immortal metal, and in doing so had lost everything that made existence worth living. They were no longer beings who experienced reality, they were machines that processed it. The Khatan had promised immortality, and they had delivered on that promise in the most literal and terrible way possible. The Necrons would never die, never age, never sicken. They would also never truly live again. They were undying consciousness in dead metal, awareness without experience, minds that would continue functioning across eternity without ever again feeling anything at all. Zarek understood too late what he had done. The Silent King had condemned his entire species to an existence worse than the death they had feared. The short, painful lives under radiation-poisoned suns had at least been lives. There had been sensation, emotion, the capacity for genuine experience even if that experience was suffering. The Necrons had none of that. They were functionally immortal, yes, and they possessed bodies far superior to their original flesh. But the price had been everything that made existence meaningful. The Silent King had saved his people from death by transforming them into something that could never truly be called alive. The transformed Necrons stood in their legions, billions of necrodermis warriors arranged in perfect formations that stretched across continents. They no longer needed rest, no longer required sustenance, no longer feared the radiation that had killed their ancestors. Their gauss flares hummed with lethal potential, their bodies gleamed with the dull sheen of living metal, and their optical sensors glowed with an eerie green luminescence. They were the perfect soldiers the Necrontyr had always aspired to become, freed from every biological limitation that had constrained their military effectiveness. But they were also slaves. The Khatan had not merely consumed the essence of the Necrontyr during biotransference, They had established control protocols that ran deeper than any physical chains. The star gods could command the Necrons directly. They were imposed through the very technology that housed Necron consciousness. When a Catan issued an order, the Necrons found themselves compelled to obey, their bodies responding before their minds could even process resistance. This was not crude mind control that could be fought or resisted. It was fundamental domination written into the architecture of their new existence. The Necrons retained their personalities, their memories, their capacity for tactical thinking, but their autonomy was an illusion that could be revoked at any moment. The Catan themselves had undergone transformation. The star gods had been incorporeal entities of pure energy, vast but diffuse, their consciousness spread across electromagnetic fields that span light years. The Necrons constructed bodies for them, shells of necrodermis far more sophisticated than the warrior forms. These bodies gave the Catan physical presence, allowed them to interact with the material universe in ways they never could as energy patterns. Azagorod the Nightbringer manifested in a form that towered over the battlefield, a skeletal figure wreathed in darkness that seemed to drain light from its surroundings. Mephitron the Deceiver wore a body that shifted and changed, its appearance never quite fixed, always suggesting something other than what it actually was. Magladroth the Void Dragon took a form of terrible mechanical beauty, its necrodermis body incorporating design elements that hinted at its affinity for technology and material science. The empowered Catan were entities of terrifying capability. They wielded powers that bent physical law, manipulated fundamental forces with casual ease, and possessed strength that could shatter worlds. A Catan could tear open the fabric of space, could manipulate gravity to crush armies, could unleash stellar energies that incinerated everything in their path. The Old Ones had seemed invincible with their mastery of the webway and their psychic powers, but the Catan operated on principles that even the ancient race struggled to counter. These were beings that had existed since the galaxy's youth, that understood the material universe at a level the Old Ones, for all their biological mastery, could not match. The Necrons returned to the war in heaven with their new masters at their head. The Catan directed strategy while the Necron Legions executed it with mechanical precision. Where the Necrontyr had fought with passion and desperation, the Necrons fought with cold efficiency. They did not tire during extended campaigns. They did not break under fire or flee from superior forces. They did not require supply lines or logistical support beyond the occasional need for repairs. A Necron warrior could fight for centuries without pause, could be destroyed and rebuilt from its remains, could execute orders with perfect accuracy regardless of casualties. They were the tireless soldiers that every military commander dreams of and every enemy fears. The Old Ones found themselves facing an enemy fundamentally different from the Necrontyr they had been defeating. Necron fleets no longer retreated when outmaneuvered. They pressed attacks with mechanical determination, accepting catastrophic losses to achieve objectives. Necron ground forces established beachheads and held them against overwhelming counterattacks, their warriors simply reforming from the necrodermis puddles left by gauss weapon strikes. The Old Ones' tactical advantages remained. They still possessed the webway, still wielded psychic powers that the Necrons could not replicate, but these advantages no longer guaranteed victory. The Catan themselves took to the battlefield, and where they walked, reality bent. Azagorod harvested the terror of dying Old One warriors, feeding on their fear as they faced a being that embodied death itself. The Nightbringer's presence on a battlefield was a weapon in its own right. Old One forces would break and flee at the sight of it, their courage evaporating before an entity that seemed to be mortality given form. Mephitron employed subterfuge and deception on scales that confounded Old One commanders, creating false intelligence, impersonating leaders, and sowing discord in enemy ranks. The Deceiver fought wars of information and trust, turning the Old One's own organizational structures against them. The war ground on, no longer the one-sided conflict it had been. Necron Legions pushed into Old One territory, their advance measured in light years and centuries. They did not conquer quickly. The Old Ones were too ancient, too powerful, too deeply entrenched across the galaxy for rapid victory. But the Necrons did not need rapid victory. They had eternity. Their warriors could fight the same battle for decades without degradation in performance. Their fleets could maintain blockades for centuries. Their armies could besiege worlds for millennia if necessary. The Old Ones, despite their longevity, could not match this inhuman patience. They grew weary in ways the Necrons never would. The Immaterium began to change. The warp had always existed as a parallel dimension to real space, a realm of psychic energy that reflected the thoughts and emotions of sentient beings. For most of galactic history, the warp had been relatively calm, its currents gentle and navigable. The Old Ones had used it as a source of their psychic power, drawing on its energies to fuel their reality-warping abilities. But the war in heaven was generating psychic trauma on an unprecedented scale. Trillions died in the conflict, their death agonies echoing through the Immaterium. Fear, rage, hatred, and despair flooded into the warp from countless battlefields across the galaxy. These emotions began to coalesce. The warp was not merely a passive reflection of real space consciousness. It was a realm where thought could become substance, where sufficiently strong emotions could achieve independent existence. The carnage of the war in heaven provided more than enough psychic energy for this process. Entities began to form in the Immaterium, predatory consciousnesses born from the concentrated emotions of dying civilizations. These were not the great powers that would later dominate the warp. Those would require even greater catastrophes to gestate fully. But they were dangerous nonetheless, creatures of appetite and malice that fed on psychic energy and hungered for more. The Old Ones found their greatest advantage compromised. The warp, which had been their domain, was becoming hostile territory. The psychic powers they wielded drew the attention of warp predators, entities that followed the trail of psychic energy back to its source. Old One Psychers found themselves under assault not just from Necron weapons, but from immaterial creatures that tore at their consciousness. The webway remained safe. Its tunnels were sealed against the warp's direct influence, but the Old One's ability to draw power from the Immaterium was increasingly contested by entities that saw them as prey rather than masters. The Old Ones made a desperate decision. They had created servant races before, biological constructs designed for specific purposes, but never warrior species on the scale they now required. The Necrons were too numerous, too relentless, too difficult to permanently destroy. The Catan were too powerful for the Old Ones to face directly without suffering catastrophic losses. The ancient race needed soldiers, vast armies of warriors who could match the Necrons' tireless advance and contest the Catan's reality warping power. They turned to their mastery of biological manipulation and began to craft new species from the genetic material of existing races. The Eldari were the first of these warrior races to emerge. The Old Ones took existing psychic species and refined them, enhancing their connection to the warp while giving them physical forms capable of housing that power. The Eldari were tall and slender, their bodies optimized for speed and precision rather than brute strength. But their true capability lay in their psychic potential. Every Eldari possessed some degree of connection to the Immaterium, and their most gifted individuals could wield powers that rivaled the Old Ones themselves. They could see the future through the warp's currents, could manipulate matter with thought, could strike at enemies across vast distances through psychic assault. The Eldari were not merely weapons, they were a civilization in their own right, created with culture, art, and the capacity for independent development. The Old Ones had learned from previous attempts at creating servant races that warriors needed more than combat capability to be effective. They needed motivation, identity, purpose beyond simple obedience. The Eldari possessed all of this. They were beautiful, creative, and passionate, their emotions running deeper than most species could comprehend. This emotional intensity enhanced their psychic abilities, but also made them vulnerable to the predatory entities now stirring in the warp. The Krork were the Old Ones' answer to a different problem. Where the Eldari were elegant and psychically potent, the Krork were brutal and physically overwhelming. The Old Ones engineered them for resilience and aggression, creating a species that thrived on warfare. The Krork were massive creatures, standing far taller than the Eldari or the Old Ones themselves, their bodies packed with muscle and protected by thick skin. They possessed a crude but effective psychic gestalt. Individual Krork had minimal psychic ability, but when gathered in large numbers, they generated a collective field that could alter probability and enhance their technology. The Krork reproduced through spores, a biological mechanism that made them nearly impossible to eradicate. Kill a Krork and its body would release spores that would eventually grow into new Krork. Destroy an entire Krork army, and the spores they left behind would germinate, creating a new generation of warriors. This reproductive strategy meant that any world the Krork fought on would eventually develop a Krork population, creating a self-sustaining military presence that required no external support. The Krork were designed as a biological weapon that could be deployed and then left to multiply and fight without further Old One intervention. The Old Ones deployed their new warrior races against the Necron Legions. The Eldari struck with precision and psychic fury, their seers identifying critical points in Necron strategy, and their warriors executing surgical strikes that disrupted enemy operations. They could not permanently destroy Necrons. The living metal bodies would eventually reform, but they could delay and harass, buying time for Old One forces to reposition. The Eldari's psychic abilities allowed them to contest the Khatan's reality manipulation, creating zones where physical law remained stable and the Star God's powers were constrained. The Krork fought with overwhelming numbers and savage aggression. They crashed into Necron battle lines like green tides, their crude weapons surprisingly effective against necrodermis armor. The Krork did not fight with Necron precision, they fought with enthusiasm and a love of violence that made them dangerous despite their lack of sophistication. Their psychic gestalt allowed their ramshackle technology to function far better than it should, their weapons firing with improbable accuracy, and their vehicles holding together through sheer collective belief. The Krork could match the Necrons' tirelessness with their own relentless aggression, and their spore-based reproduction meant that casualties were temporary setbacks rather than permanent losses. The war in heaven entered its final, most catastrophic phase. Necron legions clashed with Eldari hosts and Krork hordes across thousands of worlds. The Khatan manifested on battlefields where Old Ones directed their warrior races, the ancient enemies finally meeting in direct combat. Entire star systems were destroyed in the fighting, their suns extinguished or detonated, their planets reduced to debris fields. The Necrons employed weapons that could unmake matter at the quantum level, while the Old Ones and their servants wielded psychic powers that tore holes in reality. The galaxy became a charnel house, the death toll climbing into the quadrillions. The warp deteriorated further with each passing century. The psychic trauma of the war fed the predatory entities in the immaterium, strengthening them, giving them greater cohesion and power. The calm warp that had existed before the war in heaven was gone, replaced by a roiling dimension of malevolent currents and hungry consciousnesses. The Old Ones watched their domain corrupt, the immaterium they had once mastered becoming increasingly hostile to their presence. Their psychic powers grew more dangerous to use as warp predators learned to follow the energy trails back to their sources. The Old Ones began to fall. The ancient race had seemed invincible, their mastery of biology and the warp placing them beyond the reach of lesser species. But they were not infinite. The Khatan hunted them specifically, targeting Old One strongholds and research facilities. Azagorod killed them and fed on their death fear. Mephatron infiltrated their sanctuaries through deception and murdered them in their places of power. The Necron legions ground down their defenses through sheer relentless pressure, accepting catastrophic casualties to achieve objectives that brought them closer to Old One centers of power. The Eldari and Krork fought desperately to protect their creators, but they could not be everywhere at once. The Old Ones had spread themselves thin across the galaxy, maintaining research stations and monitoring posts on thousands of worlds. The Necrons systematically destroyed these installations, killing the Old Ones within and demolishing their works. The ancient race's numbers dwindled as the war consumed them. They had lived for millions of years, had shaped the evolution of countless species, had mastered powers that made them seem like gods to younger races. But they were mortal, and mortality always claims its due eventually. The final Old Ones died in scattered groups, hunted down by Necron kill teams and Khatan avatars. Some fell defending their last strongholds, their psychic powers blazing as they took hordes of Necrons with them into death. Others died alone on forgotten worlds, the last of their kind watching the stars go dark as Necron fleets extinguished suns to deny the Catan sustenance. The Old One's civilization collapsed, their works abandoned, their knowledge lost or scattered. The Eldari and Krork were left orphaned, warrior races created for a war that was ending but without the guidance of their creators. The Necrons had won. They had defeated the Old Ones, had achieved the victory that had seemed impossible when they were still the dying Necrontyr. But the cost was beyond calculation. The galaxy was shattered, entire regions depopulated or destroyed outright. The warp was permanently corrupted, the psychic trauma of quadrillions of deaths having transformed it into a hell dimension that would never return to its previous state. The Necrons stood triumphant in their legions, undying warriors who had conquered the galaxy's oldest civilization, and they felt nothing. No joy at victory, no satisfaction at achieving their goal, no relief that the war was finally over. They were hollow metal shells, consciousness without experience, and they would remain that way forever. The Old Ones were dead, their civilization reduced to ruins scattered across a devastated galaxy. The Necrons stood victorious, their legions occupying worlds that had once belonged to the ancient race. But victory brought no relief. The Necron warriors remained enslaved to the Catan, their consciousness trapped in necrodermis bodies that responded to the star god's commands before their own will could even assert itself. The Catan had grown immensely powerful during the war, gorging themselves not just on the essence they had consumed during biotransference, but on the death and terror generated by quadrillions of casualties. Azagora, the Nightbringer, had fed on fear across countless battlefields, becoming so saturated with the psychic resonance of mortality that its very presence caused living beings to experience primal terror. The other Catan had similarly glutted themselves on the war's carnage, each growing in power according to its particular appetites. Zarek watched his people serve their masters and understood with perfect clarity that the Necrons had merely exchanged one form of slavery for another. They had been slaves to their dying flesh, bodies that betrayed them through cancer and radiation damage. Now they were slaves to the Catan, their immortal forms subject to the absolute control of beings who viewed them as tools rather than people. The Silent King still retained his authority over the Necron dynasties in matters the Catan did not directly countermand, but that authority was hollow. Any order he gave could be overridden by a Catan's will. Any strategy he devised could be altered or abandoned if it did not serve the star god's purposes. The dynastic structure remained intact in form, but its substance had been gutted by the reality of Catan dominance. The Catan began to reveal their true nature now that the Old Ones no longer posed a threat. They had been focused during the war, their attention directed toward defeating the ancient enemy and claiming the galaxy for themselves. With that goal achieved, the star gods turned their attention to other appetites. They harvested populations of the younger races for sport and sustenance, descending on worlds to feed on the life essence of billions. They fought among themselves over territory and resources, their conflicts devastating entire star systems as reality bent under the strain of their clashing powers. The Necrons were deployed in these internecine struggles, forced to fight on behalf of one Catan against another, their legions grinding each other down in wars that served no purpose beyond their masters' egos and appetites. Zarek began to understand the full scope of the trap his people had fallen into. The Catan would never release the Necrons. Why would they? The Necron Legions were the perfect servants, tireless, obedient, and capable of being rebuilt after destruction. The star gods commanded armies that could not rebel, could not question orders, could not refuse even suicide missions. More than that, the Necrons themselves represented a resource the Catan valued. The biotransference process had consumed the Necrons' essence, but traces remained, embedded in the necrodermis bodies and the energy matrices that housed their consciousness. The Catan fed on these traces, slowly draining what little remained of the Necrons' original vitality. The Silent King realized that the Catan planned to consume the Necrons entirely. It would not happen quickly. The star gods were patient beings who thought in terms of millions of years. But eventually, the Catan would drain every last fragment of essence from their servants, leaving behind empty necrodermis shells animated by nothing more than base programming. The Necrons would cease to exist as conscious beings and become mere automatons, sophisticated machines without genuine awareness. Everything that remained of the Necrontyr, their memories, their personalities, their capacity for thought, would be devoured, and the Catan would continue on as they always had, drifting through the galaxy in search of new sources of sustenance. Zarek could not allow this. He had already condemned his people to an existence of hollow immortality, had stripped them of their capacity for sensation and emotion in pursuit of victory against the Old Ones. He would not permit the Catan to erase them entirely. The Silent King began to plan rebellion, but he faced obstacles that seemed insurmountable. The Catan could command the Necrons directly through the control protocols built into their necrodermis bodies. Any overt resistance would be crushed before it could begin, the rebellious Necrons simply overridden and forced back into obedience. Zarek needed a way to circumvent these controls, to free the Necrons from Catan domination long enough to strike back. The solution came from the Necrons' own technology. The Cryptex, Necrons who had specialized in scientific and technical disciplines during their time as Necrontyr, retained their knowledge and analytical capabilities despite biotransference. These individuals had built the machines that enabled the transformation from flesh to metal, had collaborated with the Catan to create the necrodermis bodies that now housed Necron consciousness. They understood the control protocols because they had helped implement them. Zarek gathered the most brilliant Cryptex in secret, tasking them with finding weaknesses in the systems that enslaved their people. The work proceeded slowly over centuries. The Cryptex could not act openly. Any hint of their true purpose would draw Catan attention and immediate termination of the project. They disguised their research as routine maintenance and optimization of Necron systems, making incremental discoveries that gradually mapped the architecture of Catan control. They learned that the control protocols operated through specific command frequencies, that Catan directives propagated through the necrodermis network in predictable patterns, that there were brief windows during system updates when individual Necrons could act autonomously before the controls reasserted themselves. The Cryptex developed countermeasures. They could not simply remove the Catan control protocols. The star gods would notice immediately and reassert their dominance. Instead, they created systems that could temporarily suppress the controls, generating interference that blocked Catan commands for brief periods. These suppression systems were built into new necrodermis bodies during routine repairs and upgrades, spreading slowly through the Necron Legions without attracting attention. The Cryptex also developed weapons that could harm the Catan, technologies that would have been impossible without the deep understanding of star god physiology they had gained through decades of forced servitude. Blackstone became the key to these weapons. The material had unusual properties that the Necrontyr had studied before biotransference, but never fully exploited. Blackstone could interact with psychic energy in ways that normal matter could not, either amplifying or nullifying warp-based phenomena depending on its configuration. More importantly, Blackstone could affect the Catan themselves. The star gods existed as energy patterns given physical form through necrodermis bodies, and Blackstone could disrupt those patterns. Weapons constructed from properly configured Blackstone could actually damage Catan, could destabilize the energy matrices that gave them coherence and power. The Cryptex also developed Tesseract labyrinths, devices that exploited dimensional technology to create pocket universes. These were not simple containers, but genuine alternate dimensions, spaces that existed outside normal reality and could be sealed against external interference. A Tesseract labyrinth could trap entities that would be impossible to contain through conventional means, holding them in dimensional prisons from which escape required capabilities beyond even Catan power. The labyrinths were small, no larger than a Necron warrior's hand, but their internal dimensions were effectively infinite. Anything trapped within would be lost in an endless maze of folded space, unable to find its way back to real space. Zarek coordinated the rebellion with the same precision he had once applied to military campaigns against the Old Ones. He identified Catan who were isolated from their fellows, star gods who had wandered far from others of their kind in pursuit of their own agendas. He positioned Necron forces loyal to his cause, or at least equipped with the suppression systems that would allow them to act autonomously near these targets. He stockpiled Blackstone weapons and Tesseract labyrinths, distributing them to units across multiple dynasties. The preparation took millennia, but the Necrons had time. They were immortal, and the C'tan suspected nothing. The rebellion began simultaneously across dozens of star systems. Necron forces activated their suppression systems, blocking C'tan control protocols for the first time since biotransference. Warriors who had been slaves for millions of years suddenly found themselves able to act according to their own will. The sensation was disorienting. They had grown accustomed to the C'tan's commands overriding their autonomy, had adapted to existence as extensions of their master's will. Now they were free, at least temporarily, and they turned their weapons on the beings who had enslaved them. The C'tan reacted with shock and rage. They had never conceived that their servants might rebel, had assumed the control protocols made such resistance impossible. The star gods unleashed their reality warping powers, attempting to crush the uprising through sheer force. They tore open space to swallow Necron armies, manipulated gravity to compress warriors into singularities, unleashed stellar fire that should have vaporized everything it touched. But the Necrons pressed forward with mechanical determination, accepting catastrophic casualties to bring their Blackstone weapons into range. The first C'tan to fall was one of the lesser star gods, an entity that had fed primarily on stellar radiation and possessed relatively limited combat capability compared to beings like the Nightbringer or the Deceiver. Necron forces surrounded it, weathering its attacks until they could deploy Blackstone weapons at close range. The weapons fired and the C'tan's energy matrix destabilized. The star god's necrodermis body began to fragment, pieces of living metal falling away as the cohesion holding them together failed. The C'tan screamed, a sound that registered across multiple dimensions, and then its consciousness began to fracture. The Cryptex deployed a Tesseract labyrinth, activating it at the moment of the C'tan's destabilization. The device opened, creating a dimensional rift that drew in the fragmenting star god. The C'tan fought against the pull, its vast power straining against the labyrinth's attraction, but it was weakened by the Blackstone weapons and could not resist. The entity shattered into multiple pieces, each piece drawn into the Tesseract labyrinth's infinite interior. The device sealed, trapping the fragments in separate dimensional pockets where they would remain imprisoned forever, unable to reconstitute themselves or escape back to real space. The Necrons had proven that the C'tan could be defeated. Zarek broadcast this information across the entire Necron network, transmitting tactical data on C'tan vulnerabilities and the effectiveness of Blackstone weapons. The rebellion spread as dynasties that had been waiting for proof of concept joined the uprising. Necron forces across the galaxy turned on their masters, deploying suppression systems and Blackstone weapons against star gods who had ruled them for millions of years. The C'tan found themselves fighting for survival against the very servants they had created. The star gods were powerful, but they were not invincible. Each C'tan was an individual entity, separate from its fellows and often in conflict with them. The Necrons exploited this, attacking isolated C'tan before they could gather together for mutual defense. Blackstone weapons proved devastatingly effective, disrupting the energy patterns that gave the star gods coherence. The C'tan could still fight back. Their reality warping powers destroyed entire Necron armies, but they could not prevent their own fragmentation when enough Blackstone weapons were brought to bear. The Necrons shattered the C'tan systematically, hunting down each star god and breaking it into shards. The process was not simple destruction. The C'tan could not be truly killed in any conventional sense. They were patterns of energy that had existed since the galaxy's formation, entities too fundamental to reality to be simply erased. Instead, the Necrons fragmented them, using Blackstone weapons to break each C'tan into hundreds or thousands of shards. Each shard retained a portion of the original entity's consciousness and power, but none possessed the full capabilities of the complete C'tan. The shards were imprisoned in Tesseract labyrinths, each fragment sealed in its own dimensional prison. Some Necrons kept these imprisoned shards, studying them or using their residual power to fuel Necron technology. The shards remained dangerous even in captivity. They were still fragments of godlike beings, capable of influencing reality within the confines of their prisons. But they were contained, separated from each other and from the material universe, unable to reconstitute themselves into the terrible entities they had once been. Azagorod the Nightbringer was shattered into hundreds of shards, each one carrying a portion of its association with death and terror. Mephitron the Deceiver fragmented into pieces that retained its capacity for manipulation and falsehood. Magladroth the Void Dragon was broken and imprisoned, though some Necron records suggested that its largest shard was secured in a vault of particular importance. Every Catan that had participated in the biotransference, that had enslaved the Necrons and fed on their essence, was hunted down and shattered. The star gods who had seemed invincible were reduced to imprisoned fragments, their power broken and their threat neutralized. The war against the Catan cost the Necrons dearly. Entire legions were annihilated in the fighting, their necrodermis bodies damaged beyond even living metal's capacity for self-repair. Dynasties that had survived the war in heaven intact were reduced to fragments of their former strength. The Necrons had won their freedom, but the price was measured in millions of destroyed warriors and devastated holdings. They stood victorious over the shattered remains of their former masters, and they felt nothing, no satisfaction, no relief, no joy at their liberation. They were still hollow consciousnesses in metal shells, still incapable of genuine experience or emotion. Zarek surveyed the galaxy and saw the full scope of what the Necrons had lost. They were free from the Catan, but they remained trapped in necrodermis bodies that could never die and could never truly live. The essence that had been consumed during biotransference was gone forever, irretrievable even with all the Necrons' technological sophistication. They would exist as they were for eternity, conscious but not alive, aware but incapable of experience, immortal but hollow. The galaxy itself was devastated, entire regions depopulated by the wars in heaven, the warp corrupted into a hell dimension that would never return to its previous state. The younger races had survived and multiplied during the final stages of the war. The Eldari had established their own civilization, no longer servants of the Old Ones, but an independent empire that spanned the galaxy. The Krork had spread across countless worlds, their spore-based reproduction ensuring their presence wherever they had fought. Other species had emerged or evolved during the millions of years of conflict, filling ecological niches left empty by the war's devastation. The galaxy belonged to these younger races now, species that could still feel and experience and live in ways the Necrons never would again. The Necrons controlled a galaxy of ashes. Their legions stood on worlds reduced to lifeless rocks by the wars in heaven. Their fleets patrolled systems where stars had been extinguished or detonated, and their dynasties claimed territories that had been depopulated by millions of years of conflict. They had defeated the Old Ones and shattered the Catan, achieving victories that should have secured their dominance for eternity. But Zarek understood what many of his nobles refused to acknowledge. The Necrons were catastrophically weakened. The wars had destroyed vast numbers of warriors, the rebellion against the Catan had consumed entire legions, and the Necron population had been reduced to a fraction of what it had been before biotransference. The younger races presented a problem that Necron military doctrine was ill-equipped to address. The Eldari had multiplied across the galaxy, establishing an empire that rivaled the Necrons' own territorial claims. Their population numbered in the quadrillions, spread across countless worlds, and supported by sophisticated infrastructure that the Old Ones had helped them develop. The Eldari were psychically potent, technologically advanced, and possessed the webway, that cursed network of extra-dimensional tunnels that gave them strategic mobility the Necrons could not match. The Krork had similarly proliferated, their spore-based reproduction ensuring their presence on thousands of worlds. Where Krork fought, more Krork would inevitably follow as the spores germinated and grew into new warriors. Zarek conducted strategic assessments that painted an increasingly grim picture. The Necrons could win individual battles against the younger races. Their technology remained superior in many respects, and their warriors were individually more durable than Eldari or Krork forces. But the Necrons could not win a war of attrition. Every destroyed Necron warrior represented an irreplaceable loss. The biotransference process could not be repeated. The Catan who had enabled it were shattered and imprisoned, their knowledge of the specific techniques lost or deliberately destroyed during the rebellion. Necron cryptechs could repair damaged warriors and even reconstruct them from fragments, but they could not create new Necrons. The population that existed after the Catan's defeat was all there would ever be. The Eldari and Krork, by contrast, could replace their losses. Eldari reproduced slowly by the standards of most species, but they reproduced. Krork regenerated through spores faster than the Necrons could exterminate them. A war against the younger races would be a grinding conflict of decades or centuries, and at the end of it, the Necrons would be diminished, while their enemies would have recovered their numbers. The strategic mathematics were unavoidable. The Necrons could not hold the galaxy against determined opposition from species that could replenish their populations. Internal divisions compounded the external threat. The Necron dynasties had never been truly unified, even under the Silent King's absolute authority. The old rivalries and competitions that had characterized Necrontyr politics had survived biotransference, transmitted through the memories and personalities that had been imprinted onto necrodermis bodies. Pharaons and overlords who had competed for status and territory as Necrontyr continued those competitions as Necrons. The rebellion against the Catan had required cooperation, but with the star gods defeated, the dynasties began to fracture again along ancient fault lines. Some dynasties wanted to continue the war against the younger races, to exterminate the Eldari and Krork before they could grow stronger. These warlike nobles argued that the Necrons possessed superior technology and should use it to secure their dominance while they still maintained numerical superiority in certain regions. Other dynasties advocated for consolidation, for withdrawing to core territories and fortifying them against external threats. These conservatives recognized the demographic problem, but believed that concentrated defenses could hold off younger race incursions indefinitely. Still, other dynasties pursued their own agendas entirely, ignoring the broader strategic situation in favor of settling old grudges or claiming specific territories they considered rightfully theirs. Zarek convened the Triarch to address the crisis. The three members of the council had served the Silent King since before biotransference, their consciousness preserved in necrodermis bodies that marked them as among the most important individuals in Necron civilization. They reviewed strategic reports from across the galaxy, analyzed demographic projections, and consulted with cryptechs about the Necrons' technological capabilities and limitations. The conclusion they reached was unanimous and unavoidable. The Necrons could not maintain their empire in their current state. They needed time for the younger races to destroy themselves or decline, time for the galaxy to change in ways that might favor Necron resurgence. The Silent King made his decision. The Necrons would enter a period of hibernation, a great sleep that would last until the galaxy had transformed into something more favorable to their return. The younger races were ascendant now, but history suggested that civilizations rose and fell. The Eldari might dominate the galaxy today, but eventually they would decline or destroy themselves. The Krork might spread across thousands of worlds, but without the old ones to guide them, they would likely devolve into something less threatening. The Necrons would wait, patient as only immortal beings could be, and when they awakened, they would find a galaxy ripe for reconquest. The construction of the tomb complexes began immediately. Necron cryptechs designed vast underground facilities that could house entire dynasties in stasis, preserving the warriors and their command structure through millions of years of inactivity. These were not simple bunkers or storage facilities, but sophisticated installations that incorporated the most advanced Necron technology. Each tomb complex was built deep beneath a world's surface, protected by kilometers of rock and equipped with defense systems that could repel intruders. The tombs needed to survive not just enemy action, but the natural geological processes that would reshape worlds over millions of years. The stasis crypts themselves were marvels of temporal manipulation. Necron warriors would be placed in a state of complete suspension, their consciousness frozen at a specific moment, and their necrodermis bodies locked in temporal stasis. Time would not pass for the sleeping Necrons. They would experience the transition from entering the crypts to awakening as instantaneous, regardless of how many millions of years elapsed in the outside universe. The crypts were arranged in vast halls that stretched for kilometers, each one housing thousands of warriors in perfect geometric arrays. The sight of a fully populated tomb complex was striking even to Necron sensibilities. Endless rows of inactive warriors standing in formation, their optical sensors dark, their weapons powered down, waiting for a signal that might not come for eons. The tomb complexes required custodians, automated systems that could maintain the facilities and respond to threats during the Great Sleep. The Necrons deployed canoptech constructs for this purpose, sophisticated machines that operated according to complex programming rather than genuine consciousness. Canoptech wraiths phased through solid matter to patrol the tomb complexes, their dimensional displacement technology allowing them to move through walls and floors as they searched for intruders or malfunctions. Canoptech scarabs swarmed through the facilities in clouds of thousands, their small forms equipped with tools for repairs and maintenance. Canoptech spiders towered over the other constructs, their multiple limbs capable of performing complex repairs and their programming sophisticated enough to coordinate lesser constructs. The defense systems incorporated weapons technology that could activate automatically in response to intrusions. Gauss flare arrays could be deployed from hidden positions to sweep corridors with molecular stripping fire. Particle whips could lash out at targets that approached too close to critical systems. The tombs were designed to be death traps for anyone foolish enough to penetrate their outer defenses, with multiple layers of security that would activate in sequence to eliminate intruders. The canoptech constructs served as mobile defenders, responding to breaches and coordinating the tomb's automated weapons to maximum effect. Zarek established the conditions for awakening. Each tomb complex was equipped with monitoring systems that would track external conditions and trigger the awakening protocols when specific criteria were met. Some tombs were programmed to wake if they detected Necron technology nearby, suggesting that other dynasties had already begun their return. Others would activate if they registered significant threats to the tomb itself, rousing the sleepers to defend their resting place. Still others incorporated more sophisticated triggers, monitoring stellar positions or galactic conditions, and awakening when the galaxy had changed in predetermined ways. The Silent King made his most controversial decision regarding the command protocols. The control systems that had allowed the Catan to dominate the Necrons remained embedded in their necrodermis bodies, though they had been modified to respond to Necron authority rather than Star God commands. Zarek held the master protocols, the command codes that gave him absolute authority over every Necron in existence. These protocols were what made him the Silent King, what gave his orders the force of physical law rather than mere political authority. Any Necron who received a direct command from Zarek through these protocols would find their body responding before their consciousness could even process the order. Zarek chose to relinquish these protocols. He dissolved the Triarch, releasing its members from their oaths of service and allowing them to return to their own dynasties. He destroyed the master command codes, ensuring that no single individual would ever again possess absolute authority over all Necrons. The Silent King's reasoning was complex and reflected his understanding of what the Necrons had lost through biotransference and enslavement to the Catan. The Necrons had been robbed of their autonomy, their capacity for genuine choice stripped away first by the Star Gods and then by the command protocols themselves. Zarek hoped that by removing these controls, the dynasties might awaken to a future where they were truly free to determine their own fate. The Silent King imposed exile upon himself. He would not enter the tomb complexes with his people, would not sleep through the ages waiting for a better galaxy. Instead, Zarek departed Necron space entirely, taking a small fleet and a handful of loyal retainers into the intergalactic void. His reasons for this self-imposed banishment were never fully explained, but Necron records suggested that he carried the guilt of what he had done to his people. Zarek had authorized biotransference, had condemned an entire species to existence as hollow consciousnesses in metal shells. He had led them through wars that consumed quadrillions of lives and devastated the galaxy. He had made decisions that saved the Necrons from extinction, but robbed them of everything that made existence meaningful. The Silent King chose exile as penance, removing himself from the civilization he had irrevocably damaged. The Great Sleep began in stages over several thousand years. Different dynasties entered their tombs at different times, some eager to begin the hibernation, and others reluctant to relinquish their holdings. The process was methodical and carefully coordinated. Each dynasty would withdraw to its designated tomb worlds, deactivating peripheral installations and consolidating forces at the primary hibernation sites. Warriors marched into the stasis crypts in perfect formation, taking their assigned positions and powering down their systems. Command staff entered last, the overlords and nemessers and pharaohs ensuring that their dynasties were properly secured before entering their own crypts. The tomb worlds fell silent. Installations that had bustled with activity for millions of years went dark as the last Necrons entered stasis. The Canoptech constructs began their eternal vigil, patrolling empty halls and maintaining systems that would not be needed for millions of years. On the surface, the tomb worlds appeared lifeless, barren planets with no obvious signs of habitation. The Necrons had deliberately chosen worlds that were unremarkable, avoiding systems that might attract the attention of younger races. The tombs were meant to be forgotten, to sleep undisturbed, until the galaxy had changed enough to favor Necron resurgence. The Great Sleep lasted approximately 60 million years, though the exact duration varied by tomb world. For the sleeping Necrons, no time passed at all. They entered the crypts and would experience awakening as the next moment of consciousness. But in the galaxy outside, ages came and went. The Eldari Empire reached heights of power and sophistication that dwarfed even the Old One's achievements, spreading across the galaxy and establishing a civilization of unparalleled elegance and psychic mastery. The Krork devolved over millions of years without the Old One's guidance, their sophisticated warrior culture degrading into something more primitive and savage. New species evolved and developed civilizations of their own, filling ecological niches left empty by the wars in Heaven's devastation. The tomb worlds did not sleep peacefully. Stellar drift carried some tomb worlds out of their original positions, their stars moving through the galaxy over millions of years and taking their planets with them. These drifting tombs found themselves in unfamiliar regions when their awakening protocols finally triggered, surrounded by stars they did not recognize and far from the territories their dynasties had once claimed. Some tomb worlds suffered catastrophic tectonic activity as their planet's geology evolved over geological timescales. Volcanic eruptions breached tomb complexes, magma flooding through halls where Necrons slept in stasis. Earthquakes collapsed sections of tombs, crushing crypts and destroying the warriors within. Younger races discovered tomb worlds and plundered them in ignorance of what they had found. Eldari explorers stumbled upon Necron installations and mistook them for ancient ruins, looting artifacts and inadvertently triggering defense systems that killed them. Human colonists in later millennia would establish settlements on tomb worlds, building cities above complexes where millions of Necrons slept. Orc warbands fought battles on tomb world surfaces, their weapons fire and explosions sending shockwaves through the rock that damaged delicate stasis systems. These intrusions sometimes triggered partial awakenings, rousing portions of a tomb's population while leaving others in stasis, creating confused situations where Necrons emerged to find their dynasty fragmented and their tomb compromised. Cascade malfunctions proved particularly devastating. The stasis crypts were sophisticated technology, but they were not infallible. A malfunction in one crypt could propagate to adjacent systems, creating chain reactions that spread through entire sections of a tomb complex. Warriors would emerge from stasis with their consciousness corrupted, their personality matrices degraded by millions of years of imperfect preservation. These damaged Necrons might retain their combat capabilities, but lose higher cognitive functions, becoming little more than automatons that followed the last orders they had received before entering stasis. Some malfunctions were more subtle, introducing errors into memory engrams that caused awakened Necrons to believe themselves still fighting the wars in heaven or still enslaved to the Khatan. The Canoptech constructs could repair physical damage, but could not address problems with consciousness matrices or corrupted personality engrams. A scarab swarm could rebuild a damaged necrodermis body, but it could not restore a Necron's memories or repair degraded cognitive functions. The constructs operated according to their programming, maintaining the tomb complexes as physical structures while remaining oblivious to the degradation affecting the sleeping warriors within. Some tomb worlds awakened to find that large portions of their population had been reduced to mindless automatons, their consciousness eroded by time until nothing remained but base programming. Entire tomb worlds were lost to stellar phenomena. Stars went nova, incinerating planets and everyone on them. Black holes consumed systems, pulling tomb worlds past event horizons into gravitational wells from which even Necron technology could not escape. Gamma-ray bursts from distant stellar events swept through regions of space, their radiation penetrating deep underground and damaging stasis systems. The Necrons had chosen their tomb worlds carefully, but 60 million years was time enough for any number of astronomical catastrophes to occur. The galaxy the Necrons would eventually awaken to bore little resemblance to the one they had left. The Eldari Empire had fallen, destroyed in a psychic cataclysm that tore open a permanent wound in reality and birthed a new power in the warp. Humanity had risen from a single world to claim millions of planets, establishing an imperium that sprawled across the galaxy. The Krork had devolved into orcs, losing the sophistication their Old One creators had given them, but retaining their love of warfare and their spore-based reproduction. Countless other species competed for resources and territory in a galaxy that had forgotten the Necrons entirely. The first tomb worlds began to wake in the 41st millennium, their monitoring systems detecting conditions that met their awakening criteria. The Necrons emerged from stasis to find themselves strangers in a transformed galaxy, their empire gone, their territories claimed by younger races, and their dynasties scattered across tomb worlds that had drifted far from their original positions. Some awakenings went smoothly, with full dynasties rousing intact and ready to reclaim what they had lost. Others were disasters, with corrupted Necrons emerging to attack their own kind or tomb worlds waking to find themselves surrounded by hostile forces. The Necron dynasties that emerged from the Great Sleep retained the rigid hierarchical structure that had defined their civilization since the days of the Necrontyr. This was not merely tradition or cultural preference. The command protocols embedded in necrodermis bodies created an unbreakable chain of authority that bound every Necron to their superiors. At the apex of each dynasty stood the Pharaon, the supreme ruler whose authority extended across entire sectors. Below them, overlords commanded legions and governed individual worlds. Lords led cohorts of warriors into battle and administered smaller territories. At the bottom of this hierarchy stood the warriors themselves, Necrons whose consciousness had degraded to the point where they were barely more than automatons following pre-programmed responses. The quality of one's necrodermis body during biotransference determined how much of the original personality survived the transformation. The wealthiest and most powerful Necrontyr had been able to commission superior bodies, shells constructed from the finest living metal and equipped with the most sophisticated consciousness matrices. These elite forms preserved their occupants' memories, analytical capabilities, and personality traits with remarkable fidelity. A Pharaon who had been a brilliant strategist as a Necrontyr remained a brilliant strategist as a Necron, their tactical acumen and political cunning intact despite the loss of genuine emotion and sensation. Their engram-stored personalities functioned at levels approaching their original biological consciousness, capable of complex reasoning, long-term planning, and adapting to novel situations. Overlords possessed necrodermis bodies of slightly lesser quality, but still sophisticated enough to preserve substantial portions of their original consciousness. These nobles retained their strategic thinking, their understanding of military doctrine, and their capacity for independent decision-making. An overlord could analyze battlefield conditions, devise tactical responses, and command their forces with the same competence they had demonstrated before biotransference. They remembered their histories, their dynastic allegiances, and their personal rivalries with other nobles. The degradation they experienced was subtle, a certain rigidity in thinking, a tendency toward established patterns rather than creative innovation, a hollowness where emotional responses should have influenced their decisions. Lords occupied a middle tier in the hierarchy, their necrodermis bodies adequate for preserving basic personality and tactical knowledge, but lacking the refinement of higher-ranked nobles. A lord could lead troops in battle, execute complex orders, and make tactical decisions within defined parameters. They retained memories of their service and understood their place in the dynastic structure. However, their capacity for independent thought was noticeably diminished compared to overlords and pharaohs. Lords tended to follow established doctrine rather than improvise, to execute orders precisely as given rather than adapt them to changing circumstances. They were competent commanders within their defined roles, but lacked the flexibility and creativity of their superiors. The command protocols that bound these nobles together operated through the same technology that had once allowed the Khatan to control the Necrons. When a pharaoh issued an order to an overlord, that command propagated through the necrodermis network with irresistible force. The overlord's body would respond to the directive before their consciousness fully processed it, their systems prioritizing the superior's command over their own will. This was not mind control in any conventional sense. The overlord remained aware of what was happening, retained their ability to think and reason, but found themselves physically incapable of refusing or disobeying. The command protocols created a hierarchy where authority was enforced at the level of physical law rather than social convention. Overlords exercised the same control over lords, who in turn commanded the warriors beneath them. Each level of the hierarchy could issue orders that the ranks below were compelled to obey, creating a chain of authority that extended from the pharaoh down to the lowliest warrior. This system eliminated the possibility of insubordination or rebellion within the dynastic structure. A lord who disagreed with an overlord's strategy would execute it anyway, their body following orders even as their mind recognized potential flaws. Warriors who might have questioned a lord's commands simply carried them out, their degraded consciousness incapable of formulating objections in the first place. The tragic reality of Necron existence became most apparent in the warriors who formed the bulk of their armies. These Necrons had been common soldiers, laborers, and lower-class citizens during their time as Necrontyr. They had undergone biotransference in the cheapest necrodermis bodies, shells that preserved only the barest fragments of their original consciousness. The warriors retained basic combat training and tactical knowledge, could operate their weapons and follow formation protocols, but almost nothing of their original personality survived. They were aware in some fundamental sense. They processed sensory input, responded to commands, and executed tasks, but they possessed no genuine inner life. A Necron warrior standing in formation experienced existence as a series of inputs and programmed responses. Enemy detected, raise weapon. Target acquired, fire. Formation command received, move to designated position. There was no reflection on these actions, no consideration of alternatives, no sense of self beyond the immediate execution of tasks. The warrior's consciousness, if it could still be called that, existed in a state of perpetual present tense. They had no capacity for planning beyond their immediate orders, no ability to form new memories in any meaningful sense, no personality that could be said to make decisions rather than simply react to stimuli. The degradation varied among the warrior class. Some retained fragments of their former selves, a tendency to favor certain tactical positions that they had preferred as living soldiers, a particular efficiency with specific weapons that reflected their original training. These were echoes rather than genuine personality traits, behavioral patterns imprinted so deeply during their biological lives that they survived the translation into necrodermis. Other warriors were completely blank, their consciousness eroded to nothing more than base programming. These most degraded Necrons functioned as sophisticated automatons, no different in practical terms from the canoptech constructs that maintained the tomb worlds. The command protocols affected warriors differently than nobles. When a lord issued an order to warriors under their command, the warriors simply executed it without any awareness of compulsion. They lacked sufficient consciousness to recognize the difference between their own will and externally imposed commands. The order arrived, was processed, and became action in a seamless flow that involved no decision-making or choice. Warriors were extensions of their commanders, while in the most literal sense, their bodies and limited consciousness serving as tools for executing strategies they could not comprehend. Pharaohs recognized the limitations this imposed on their military capabilities. An army of warriors could execute established tactics with mechanical precision, but they could not adapt to unexpected situations or demonstrate tactical flexibility. If a warrior's squad leader was destroyed, the surviving warriors would continue following their last orders indefinitely, unable to adjust to changed circumstances without new commands from a superior. Necron forces required constant direction from their officer class, with lords and overlords providing the tactical thinking that warriors could no longer generate themselves. The dynastic courts reflected this hierarchy in their organization and protocols. When a pharaoh held court, overlords attended and participated in strategic discussions, their preserved consciousness allowing them to contribute meaningfully to planning and policy. Lords might be present, but rarely spoke unless directly addressed, their diminished capacity for complex reasoning limiting their ability to engage in high-level strategic discourse. Warriors never attended court at all. They had no capacity to understand the discussions that took place there, and no ability to contribute to decision-making processes. Pharaohs exercised their authority through a combination of command protocols and the remnants of political tradition. The protocols ensured obedience, but the most effective pharaohs understood that mechanical compliance was not the same as genuine loyalty or effective service. They cultivated relationships with their overlords, recognizing that these subordinates retained enough consciousness to harbor ambitions and grievances. A pharaoh could compel an overlord to obey through the command protocols, but an overlord who resented that compulsion might execute orders with minimal effort or interpret them in ways that technically satisfied the command while undermining its intent. The quality of necrodermis bodies created a form of technological aristocracy within Necron society. Those who had been wealthy and powerful as Necrontyr possessed superior bodies that preserved more of their consciousness, while those who had been poor or low-ranking received inferior shells that left them as hollow automatons. This inequality was permanent and unchangeable. Necron cryptechs could repair and maintain necrodermis bodies, but they could not upgrade a warrior's consciousness matrix to the level of a lord's, nor could they enhance a lord's cognitive capabilities to match an overlord's. The hierarchy established during biotransference was fixed for eternity. Some Necrons who awakened with intact personalities found themselves commanding warriors who had once been their friends, family members, or trusted subordinates. These warriors no longer recognized their former relationships. Their consciousness too degraded to retain personal memories or emotional connections. A lord might command a warrior who had been their sibling as a Necrontyr, but that warrior showed no sign of recognition, no response beyond mechanical obedience to orders. The lord retained enough consciousness to remember what had been lost, to recognize the hollow shell that had once housed someone they cared about, but they felt nothing about this recognition, just the intellectual awareness of absence where feeling should have existed. The command protocols occasionally malfunctioned, particularly in tomb worlds that had suffered damage during the Great Sleep. A corrupted protocol might cause a warrior to freeze in place, unable to process commands from their superiors. More dangerously, damaged protocols sometimes created feedback loops, where warriors responded to commands that had never been issued, following orders from millions of years ago, or executing tactical doctrines appropriate to battles long since concluded. These malfunctioning Necrons had to be destroyed or placed back in stasis for repair, as their corrupted programming made them liabilities rather than assets. Overlords competed for status within their dynasties, seeking to demonstrate their value to their pharaoh and secure positions of greater authority. This competition took forms that reflected their diminished emotional capacity. They did not feel ambition or desire for power in any genuine sense, but they retained the memory of having felt such things and acted according to patterns established when they were still alive. An overlord might maneuver for command of a particularly important legion not because they wanted it, but because their personality matrix contained programming that identified such positions as desirable and generated behaviors aimed at securing them. The relationship between pharaons and their overlords sometimes resembled the political dynamics of their Necrontyr past, with subordinates seeking favor and pharaons balancing competing interests within their courts. But these were shadows of genuine politics, interactions between beings who remembered how to engage in courtly intrigue, but no longer possessed the emotions that had once motivated such behavior. A pharaon might reward an overlord's service with command of additional forces, and the overlord would accept this reward with something that mimicked satisfaction, but was actually just recognition that their status had improved according to established metrics. Lords served as the critical link between the officer class and the warrior masses. They possessed enough consciousness to understand complex orders from their overlords and enough tactical capability to translate those orders into specific commands for warriors. A lord directed their cohort like a conductor directing an orchestra, issuing a constant stream of tactical instructions that kept their warriors functioning effectively. Without this direction, warriors would simply execute their last orders indefinitely, unable to adapt as battlefield conditions changed. The most degraded warriors sometimes exhibited behavior that suggested fragments of personality struggling to assert themselves. A warrior might pause fractionally before executing an order, some remnant of their original consciousness attempting to process what they had been commanded to do. These moments of hesitation were brief and ultimately meaningless. The command protocols ensured compliance regardless of any residual resistance, but they hinted at the tragedy of what had been lost. Somewhere in that necrodermis shell, buried beneath layers of degraded programming and eroded consciousness, existed the faintest echo of someone who had once been a living, thinking being. Necron nobles who retained substantial portions of their consciousness sometimes questioned the purpose of their continued existence. They commanded armies of hollow shells, ruled territories in a galaxy that had forgotten them, and pursued objectives that would never bring satisfaction because they were incapable of feeling satisfaction. The most philosophically inclined pharaons recognized that they were trapped in an eternal cycle of meaningless activity, consciousness persisting without purpose or genuine experience. But recognizing this changed nothing. They continued to command their dynasties, make strategic decisions, and pursue their goals because that was what their personality matrices were programmed to do, and they lacked the capacity to choose otherwise. The military structure of the Necron dynasties reflected both their ancient Necrontyr origins and the modifications imposed by biotransference. At the core of every legion stood the Immortals, elite infantry, whose necrodermis bodies were constructed from superior materials and equipped with more sophisticated self-repair systems than standard warriors. An immortal retained more of their original consciousness than a warrior, though still far less than a lord or overlord. They could execute complex tactical maneuvers, adapt to changing battlefield conditions within defined parameters, and operate with a degree of independence that warriors simply did not possess. Their weapons were more powerful than the standard gauss flayers carried by warriors, gauss blasters that could strip the armor from heavy vehicles, or Tesla carbines that unleashed arcing bolts of energy capable of chaining between multiple targets. Immortals served as the backbone of Necron military operations, the reliable core around which more specialized forces were organized. They could hold defensive positions indefinitely, their enhanced durability allowing them to withstand fire that would reduce warriors to puddles of living metal. On the offensive, Immortals advanced with mechanical precision, their weapons fire coordinated to maximize casualties among enemy forces. They did not experience fear or hesitation, did not break under fire or retreat without orders. An immortal formation would continue advancing even as their comrades were destroyed around them, each surviving soldier adjusting their position to maintain formation integrity without any apparent concern for their own preservation. The warriors formed the inexhaustible battle line that characterized Necron warfare. These were the most numerous troops in any dynasty's forces, millions of necrodermis soldiers equipped with gauss flayers and arrayed in formations that stretched across battlefields. Warriors possessed minimal consciousness, their degraded minds capable of little beyond executing basic combat protocols and following direct orders from their superiors. They moved in perfect synchronization, thousands of bodies responding to commands as a single organism. When ordered to advance, they marched forward in lockstep, their pace never varying regardless of terrain or enemy fire. When commanded to fire, they raised their weapons as one and unleashed coordinated volleys that stripped matter from whatever they targeted. The true horror of facing a Necron warrior formation lay not in any individual soldier's capability, but in their collective inexorability. Warriors did not tire, did not require rest or supplies, did not suffer from morale failures or panic. They simply continued executing their orders until they were destroyed or those orders changed. Enemy forces that inflicted heavy casualties on warrior formations discovered that this achieved nothing. The destroyed Necrons would begin reanimating, their necrodermis bodies flowing back together and their consciousness matrices reactivating. Warriors who had been reduced to component atoms by heavy weapons fire would reconstitute themselves minutes or hours later, rising from pools of living metal to rejoin their formations. Reanimation protocols represented one of the Necrons' most significant tactical advantages. The technology embedded in necrodermis bodies included sophisticated self-repair systems that could reconstruct a Necron from even catastrophic damage. When a warrior was destroyed, their body did not simply cease functioning. It initiated a repair sequence that gathered scattered fragments and began rebuilding the necrodermis shell. The warrior's consciousness matrix, stored in a dimensional pocket that existed partially outside normal space, would reconnect to the repaired body once sufficient structural integrity was restored. The process was not instantaneous, and some damage was severe enough to prevent reanimation entirely, but the majority of destroyed Necrons would eventually return to functionality. This created tactical situations where enemy forces found themselves fighting the same Necron warriors multiple times in a single engagement. A squad might destroy a formation of warriors, advance past their position, and then find those same warriors reanimating behind them, reforming their lines and opening fire on the enemy's rear. Necron commanders exploited this ruthlessly, using warriors as expendable assets that tied down enemy forces while more valuable units maneuvered for advantage. The psychological impact on opponents was considerable. Soldiers who watched enemies they had killed rise again and resume attacking experienced a form of existential horror that degraded combat effectiveness even among disciplined troops. The Lich Guard represented the pinnacle of Necron infantry, elite warriors sworn to protect their overlord or pharaon through oaths that predated biotransference. These bonds of loyalty had survived the transformation into necrodermis, preserved in the consciousness matrices of Necrons, whose original personalities had been important enough to merit superior bodies. A Lich Guard retained substantial portions of their original identity, enough to remember the oaths they had sworn as living Necrontyr, and to maintain the sense of duty that had defined their service. They were not merely following programmed responses, they possessed genuine dedication to their lords, or at least the closest approximation of dedication that Necron consciousness could achieve. Lich Guard were equipped with weapons that reflected their elite status. Hyperphase swords could phase through conventional matter, allowing them to strike at enemies through their armor and shields. Warscythes combined molecular-edged blades with integrated ranged weapons, making each Lich Guard a threat at any distance. Some carried dispersion shields, energy barriers that could deflect incoming fire and even reflect it back at attackers. The Lich Guard's necrodermis bodies were constructed from the finest materials available, incorporating additional layers of self-repair systems and enhanced structural reinforcement that made them far more durable than standard warriors or even immortals. In battle, Lich Guard formations served as both bodyguards and shock troops. They accompanied their lord into the most dangerous situations, their presence ensuring that enemy forces could not simply eliminate Necron commanders through concentrated fire. When a pharaon led from the front, Lich Guard surrounded them in protective formations that intercepted attacks and eliminated threats before they could reach their charge. Simultaneously, Lichguard could be deployed as independent strike forces, their superior combat capabilities allowing them to assault hardened positions or eliminate high-value targets. They fought with a precision that exceeded even immortals, their better preserved consciousness allowing for more sophisticated tactical coordination. The destroyer cults represented a dark aberration within Necron society, formations of warriors so damaged by the Great Sleep or driven mad by their condition that they had embraced complete nihilism. These Necrons had concluded that existence as undying consciousnesses in metal shells was a curse rather than a gift, and they had fixated on exterminating all organic life as their purpose. Destroyers believed that the presence of living beings was an insult to their own unliving state, a constant reminder of what they had lost during biotransference. They sought to eliminate this reminder by destroying every living thing in the galaxy, reducing the universe to a lifeless realm where only Necrons existed. The transformation into a destroyer was both physical and psychological. Necrons who joined the destroyer cults modified their bodies, replacing their legs with anti-gravitic propulsion systems that allowed them to hover above the ground. This modification was irreversible and marked them as separate from standard Necron society. Destroyers armed themselves with weapons designed specifically for exterminating organic life, Gauss cannons that could strip flesh from bone at extended ranges, or heavy Gauss destructors that reduced entire squads to their component atoms. Their consciousness matrices degraded further as they embraced their nihilistic philosophy, what remained of their original personality subsumed by an all-consuming drive to kill. Most Necron nobles viewed destroyers with a mixture of utility and distaste. The destroyer cults were effective at their chosen purpose. No formation in a Necron army killed organic enemies more efficiently. Their single-minded focus on extermination made them ideal for certain military operations, particularly when facing numerous but poorly equipped opponents. However, destroyers were unstable assets that could not be fully controlled through normal command protocols. Their obsession with killing sometimes overrode orders from their superiors, causing them to pursue targets that were tactically irrelevant or to continue attacking after strategic objectives had been achieved. They were weapons that could not be completely aimed, tools that served their own agenda as much as their dynasty's goals. Destroyer lords led these formations, Necron nobles who had themselves embraced the nihilistic philosophy and undergone the physical modifications that marked destroyer status. These individuals retained more consciousness than standard destroyers, enough to coordinate their cult's activities and integrate them into broader military operations. A destroyer lord directed their followers with the same mechanical precision that characterized all Necron command, but their strategic thinking was warped by their obsession with exterminating organic life. They evaluated tactical situations primarily through the lens of how many living beings could be killed, sometimes making decisions that served this goal at the expense of their dynasty's broader objectives. The canoptech constructs that maintained tomb complexes also served military functions when dynasties awakened. Canoptech wraiths phased onto battlefields like mechanical specters, their dimensional displacement technology allowing them to move through solid matter and appear behind enemy lines. They were not true Necrons. They possessed no consciousness in any meaningful sense, operating according to sophisticated programming rather than genuine awareness. Wraiths served as scouts and infiltrators, their ability to phase through obstacles making them ideal for reconnaissance and assassination missions. In combat, they struck with whip-like tendrils that could phase through armor to tear at the vulnerable flesh beneath, or simply used their massive claws to rend enemies apart. Canoptech scarabs swarmed across battlefields in clouds of thousands, each individual construct no larger than a human hand, but collectively representing a significant threat. Scarabs were equipped with molecular disassemblers that allowed them to break down matter into its component parts, a capability they normally used for repairs and maintenance. On the battlefield, they turned this technology against enemy forces, swarming over vehicles and infantry to disassemble them atom by atom. A scarab swarm could reduce a battle tank to its component molecules in minutes, or strip the flesh from a living soldier in seconds. They were particularly effective against heavily armored targets, as their disassemblers worked at the molecular level and simply ignored conventional armor. Canoptech spiders served as command units for lesser constructs and as heavy support platforms. These large machines towered over infantry, their multiple legs allowing them to traverse any terrain, and their sophisticated programming enabling them to coordinate other Canoptech units. Spiders carried fabricator arrays that could construct new scarabs during battle, replacing losses and maintaining swarm strength even under heavy fire. They were also equipped with weapons, particle beamers that could superheat matter to stellar temperatures, or gloom prisms that manipulated dimensional physics to crush targets. In tomb complexes, spiders had served as maintenance overseers, but on battlefields they functioned as mobile weapons platforms and force multipliers. Tomb sentinels represented specialized Canoptech constructs designed specifically for combat rather than maintenance. These serpentine machines burrowed through solid rock, their bodies equipped with gauss weaponry and crushing claws. Tomb sentinels had been deployed in tomb complexes as a last line of defense, programmed to activate if intruders penetrated deep enough to threaten the stasis crypts themselves. When dynasties awakened and went to war, some brought their tomb sentinels with them, deploying these constructs as ambush units that could burrow beneath enemy positions and emerge without warning. A tomb sentinel erupting from underground could devastate entire formations, its weapons, fire, and physical attacks destroying enemies before they could respond to the threat. Necron tactical doctrine emphasized the systematic application of overwhelming force rather than tactical brilliance or strategic flexibility. Necron commanders identified objectives, calculated the forces required to achieve them, and deployed those forces with mechanical precision. There was no room for improvisation or creative thinking in standard Necron operations. Lords and overlords executed established protocols that had been refined over millions of years of warfare. This approach was effective because it eliminated variables and uncertainties. A Necron force would advance along predetermined routes, engage enemies according to calculated firing solutions, and achieve objectives through the methodical application of superior firepower and inexhaustible numbers. The Gauss weaponry that armed Necron forces represented technology that few other species could match. Gauss weapons operated by stripping matter apart at the molecular level, breaking the bonds that held atoms together and reducing targets to their component particles. A Gauss flayer's beam would strike a target and begin flaying away layers of matter, first clothing or light armor, then skin, then muscle and bone, until nothing remained but scattered atoms. The process was horrifyingly efficient and worked on any form of matter. Heavily armored vehicles offered no more protection than unarmored infantry. The Gauss beam simply required more time to strip through thicker materials, but it would eventually reduce even the most robust armor to nothing. This matter-stripping capability made Necron weapons particularly effective against opponents who relied on physical protection. Space Marines in power armor discovered that their ceramite plating provided only temporary protection against Gauss fire, each shot stripping away layers until the armor failed and the beam reached the flesh beneath. Imperial Guard tanks found their armor ablated by sustained Gauss fire, the molecular bonds holding their hulls together systematically destroyed until structural integrity failed. Even fortifications offered limited protection. Gauss weapons could be focused on specific points, stripping away rockcrete and plasteel to create breaches that Necron forces could exploit. The self-repairing nature of Necron forces fundamentally altered the mathematics of attrition warfare. Standard military doctrine assumed that inflicting casualties on enemy forces degraded their combat effectiveness and eventually forced withdrawal or surrender. This logic did not apply to Necrons. Destroying warriors reduced their immediate combat strength, but those warriors would begin reanimating unless their bodies were completely vaporized or their consciousness matrices were destroyed. Even catastrophic damage often proved temporary. A warrior reduced to a puddle of living metal might take hours to fully reconstitute, but they would eventually return to functionality and rejoin their formation. Necron commanders exploited this by accepting casualties that would be unthinkable for organic armies. They ordered warriors to advance into killing fields, knowing that destroyed soldiers would reanimate and continue the assault. They used formations as ablative shields, positioning warriors to absorb enemy fire while more valuable units maneuvered for advantage. The inexorable advance of self-repairing legions created psychological pressure on defenders, who watched their ammunition expenditure climb while the enemy forces they were destroying simply reformed and resumed attacking. Battles against Necrons often devolved into desperate attempts to inflict enough damage quickly enough that reanimation protocols could not keep pace, a race that defenders usually lost. The coordination between different Necron unit types reflected their hierarchical command structure. Lords directed warriors and immortals, issuing a constant stream of tactical instructions that kept these forces functioning effectively. Overlords coordinated multiple lords, positioning formations to support each other and exploiting weaknesses in enemy defenses. Lychguard responded directly to their sworn lords' commands, serving as both protection and as precision instruments for achieving critical objectives. Destroyer cults operated semi-independently, their obsession with killing organics making them reliable for certain tasks, but unpredictable for others. Canoptech constructs followed their programming, responding to threats and supporting Necron forces according to protocols established millions of years ago. The result was a military force that combined overwhelming firepower, tactical inflexibility, and terrifying resilience. Necron armies did not maneuver with the grace of Eldari forces or adapt with the creativity of human commanders. They advanced according to calculated plans, absorbed casualties that would break other armies, and ground down opposition through sheer relentless pressure. Fighting Necrons meant facing an enemy that could not be demoralized, could not be exhausted, and could not be permanently reduced in numbers unless every single warrior was completely destroyed. The dynasties that awakened in the 41st millennium brought this doctrine to bear against a galaxy that had forgotten what it meant to face the undying legions. The monolith stands as the most iconic of Necron war engines, a massive floating pyramid constructed from living metal that defies conventional understanding of military architecture. These structures are not vehicles in any traditional sense. They possess no visible propulsion systems, no exhaust ports, no mechanical components that would explain their ability to hover and maneuver. The monolith simply exists in defiance of gravity, its massive bulk floating across battlefields with ponderous inevitability. The surface of a monolith is inscribed with glyphs that predate human civilization by millions of years, symbols whose meaning has been lost even to many Necrons themselves. These inscriptions glow with the characteristic green energy that marks all Necron technology, pulsing in patterns that suggest some form of active power circulation through the structure. The primary weapon system of a monolith is the particle whip, a devastating energy projector mounted at the pyramid's apex. This weapon does not fire discrete shots, but instead projects a sustained beam of energy that can sweep across enemy formations like a scythe through wheat. The particle whip operates by exciting matter to extreme temperatures, causing molecular bonds to break down and targets to simply vaporize. Infantry caught in the beam's path are reduced to superheated gas in seconds. Armored vehicles fare only marginally better. Their hulls glow white-hot before structural integrity fails and the vehicle collapses into molten slag. The particle whip can sustain fire for extended periods, limited only by the monolith's internal power reserves, which are effectively inexhaustible by the standards of conventional warfare. 4 Gauss flux arcs are positioned at the corners of the monolith's base, providing defensive fire against targets that approach too close or attempt to flank the structure. These weapons track targets independently, their targeting systems responding to threats with mechanical precision. The Gauss flux arcs strip matter from targets in the same manner as infantry carried Gauss weapons, but with significantly greater power output. A single flux arc can reduce a squad of infantry to their component atoms in seconds, or strip the armor from a light vehicle with a sustained burst. The independent targeting of these weapons means that a monolith can engage multiple threats simultaneously, its flux arcs firing in different directions, while the particle whip sweeps across primary targets. The most strategically significant feature of a monolith is the Eternity Gate, a dimensional portal built into one face of the structure. This technology represents a fundamental manipulation of space-time that allows the monolith to serve as a teleportation hub for Necron forces. The Eternity Gate can open connections to tomb complexes, Necron ships in orbit, or other locations where Necron forces are staged. Warriors march through these portals in perfect formation, emerging onto the battlefield without the vulnerabilities associated with conventional deployment methods. The Eternity Gate can also be used to extract damaged Necron units from combat, pulling them back through the portal for repairs while fresh troops deploy to replace them. The tactical applications of this teleportation capability are profound. A monolith can deploy deep in enemy territory, then open its Eternity Gate to flood the area with Necron warriors. Defensive positions that would normally take hours or days to reduce through conventional assault can be bypassed entirely, with Necron forces simply appearing behind fortifications through the monolith's portal. The Eternity Gate also enables rapid reinforcement of threatened positions. If a Necron force finds itself under pressure, a monolith can deploy nearby and begin channeling additional troops into the battle. Enemy commanders facing Necron forces supported by monoliths must account for the possibility that any engagement could suddenly escalate as fresh warriors pour through dimensional portals. The monolith's construction incorporates quantum shielding, a defensive technology that operates on principles that seem to violate causality as understood by Imperial science. The quantum shielding does not function as a conventional energy barrier. Instead, it manipulates probability at the quantum level, making it increasingly unlikely that incoming fire will successfully impact the monolith. Projectiles that should strike the structure somehow miss by imperceptible margins. Energy beams that should burn through its hull instead dissipate without causing damage. The effect is not absolute. Sufficient firepower can overwhelm the quantum shielding through sheer volume, but it makes monoliths extraordinarily difficult to destroy through conventional weapons fire. The living metal construction of the monolith provides additional durability through its self-repair capabilities. Damage that does penetrate the quantum shielding is automatically repaired as the living metal flows back together, sealing breaches and reconstituting damaged systems. A monolith can sustain damage that would destroy conventional vehicles multiple times over and continue functioning. Only concentrated fire from the heaviest weapons, Titan-grade ordnance, naval bombardment, or equivalent firepower can inflict damage faster than the monolith can repair itself. Even then, completely destroying a monolith requires sustained fire that reduces the structure to scattered fragments too dispersed to reconstitute. Doomsday Arcs serve as mobile artillery platforms, anti-gravitic vehicles that hover across battlefields while projecting devastating firepower through their primary weapon system. The Doomsday Cannon mounted on these vehicles represents one of the most powerful man-portable energy weapons in the Necron arsenal. The cannon operates by channeling massive amounts of energy through focusing crystals, creating a beam that can punch through the heaviest armor and reduce fortifications to rubble. When fired at full power, the Doomsday Cannon's discharge is visible from orbit as a lance of green energy that burns through atmosphere and target alike. The Doomsday Cannon has two firing modes, reflecting the enormous power requirements of its primary function. At standard power, the weapon fires focused beams that can destroy individual vehicles or eliminate infantry formations. These shots draw from the Arc's power reserves at a sustainable rate, allowing for continuous fire support. At full power, the cannon draws so much energy that the Doomsday Arc must temporarily halt and divert all available power to the weapon system. The vehicle's anti-gravitic systems shut down, lowering it to the ground while capacitors charge and energy flows into the cannon's focusing array. The resulting shot can penetrate the armor of super heavy tanks, blast through fortification walls, or bring down aircraft with a single hit. The tactical doctrine for deploying Doomsday Arcs reflects this dual-mode capability. Necron commanders position these vehicles where they can fire at full power against high-value targets while remaining protected from direct assault. The Arc fires its devastating full-power shot, then maneuvers to a new position while its capacitors recharge. During this recharge period, The Arc provides fire support with standard power shots. Its Gauss flare arrays engaging secondary targets. This cycle of devastating alpha strikes, followed by mobile fire support, makes Doomsday Arcs particularly effective against armored formations and fortified positions. Annihilation barges fulfill a different role in Necron armies, serving as anti-infantry platforms that excel at eliminating large numbers of lightly armored targets. The Tesla Destructor mounted on these vehicles projects arcing bolts of energy that chain between multiple targets, each bolt splitting and jumping to nearby enemies in a cascade of destruction. A single shot from a Tesla Destructor might strike an initial target, then arc to 3 nearby soldiers, with each of those secondary bolts splitting again to engage additional targets. The result is a weapon that can devastate entire infantry formations with a single discharge. The Tesla technology employed by these weapons operates through principles that bear superficial similarity to conventional electrical weapons, but function on a fundamentally different basis. Tesla weapons do not simply discharge electrical current, they manipulate electromagnetic fields to create self-sustaining energy patterns that seek out conductive materials. Living tissue, with its water content and ionic composition, serves as an excellent conductor for Tesla energy. The bolts actively seek out targets, arcing around cover and finding paths to vulnerable enemies. Soldiers attempting to take cover behind obstacles discover that Tesla bolts simply arc around their protection, striking them from unexpected angles. Annihilation barges mount their Tesla Destructors on rotating turrets that provide 360-degree coverage. The vehicles patrol battlefields, their weapons tracking targets and unleashing cascading energy discharges into enemy formations. The anti-gravitic propulsion systems allow annihilation barges to traverse any terrain, hovering over obstacles that would halt conventional vehicles. This mobility, combined with the area effect nature of Tesla weapons, makes annihilation barges particularly effective at disrupting enemy infantry advances and eliminating light vehicles. The combination of Doomsday Arcs and annihilation barges provides Necron forces with comprehensive fire support capabilities. Doomsday Arcs eliminate heavy targets and fortifications with their devastating main weapons, while annihilation barges sweep enemy infantry and light vehicles from the battlefield with cascading Tesla fire. Necron commanders coordinate these vehicles to create overlapping fields of fire that leave enemy forces with no safe approach vectors. Infantry attempting to advance find themselves targeted by Tesla Destructors that chain lightning through their formations. Armored vehicles attempting to provide fire support are engaged by Doomsday cannons that punch through their heaviest armor. The Tesseract Vault represents technology so dangerous that most Necron dynasties hesitate to deploy it, except in the most desperate circumstances. These massive constructs house imprisoned Catan shards, fragments of the star gods that the Necrons shattered during their rebellion millions of years ago. The vault itself is a mobile Tesseract labyrinth, a dimensional prison that contains the Catan shard in a pocket universe from which escape should be impossible. The exterior of the vault is covered in containment glyphs and power regulators, systems designed to maintain the dimensional barriers that keep the shard imprisoned. The entire structure hovers on anti-gravitic systems, its massive bulk requiring significant power just to remain aloft. The Catan shard imprisoned within a Tesseract vault remains conscious and aware despite its captivity. These fragments retain portions of their original entity's personality and power, though vastly diminished from what the complete Catan once wielded. A shard of the Nightbringer still embodies death and terror, though it can no longer harvest fear across entire star systems. A shard of the Deceiver retains its capacity for manipulation and falsehood, though its schemes are now limited to immediate tactical situations rather than galaxy-spanning plots. The shards rage against their imprisonment, testing the dimensional barriers constantly and seeking any weakness that might allow escape. When a Necron force deploys a Tesseract vault, they do so with the understanding that they are unleashing a weapon they cannot fully control. The vault's containment systems can be deliberately weakened, allowing the Catan shard within to project its reality warping powers outward into the material universe. The shard cannot escape its prison, but it can affect the space around the vault, manipulating physical laws and unleashing devastating attacks on nearby enemies. The specific effects depend on which Catan the shard originated from. A Nightbringer shard projects waves of terror that cause enemies to flee in panic or simply die from fear-induced cardiac arrest, while a Deceiver shard creates illusions and false sensor readings that confuse enemy forces. The danger of deploying a Tesseract Vault lies in the possibility of containment failure. The dimensional barriers that imprison the Catan shard are sophisticated but not infallible. Heavy weapons fire can damage the vault's containment systems, weakening the barriers and giving the shard opportunities to escape. If containment fails completely, the Catan shard breaks free and becomes an uncontrolled force on the battlefield. A freed shard will immediately attack the nearest living beings, feeding on their life essence and growing stronger with each kill. Necron forces that deployed the vault find themselves facing the very entity they attempted to weaponize, and Catan shards harbor deep hatred for the species that shattered and imprisoned them. Necron overlords who authorize the deployment of Tesseract vaults must weigh the tactical benefits against the risks. The reality warping powers of a Catan shard can turn the tide of battles that would otherwise be lost, eliminating threats that conventional Necron forces cannot effectively engage. Psykers find their powers disrupted or turned against them by Catan reality manipulation. Enemy war machines malfunction as physical laws become unreliable in the shard's presence. Entire enemy formations can be eliminated through applications of power that ignore conventional defenses. However, if the containment fails, the consequences can be catastrophic not just for the enemy, but for the Necron forces that deployed the vault. The Necron obelisk serves a similar purpose to the Tesseract vault, but with different implementation. These structures are smaller than vaults and house less powerful Catan shards, fragments that retain only minimal portions of their original entity's capabilities. The obelisk functions as both a weapons platform and a containment vessel, its systems designed to channel the imprisoned shard's power into focused attacks rather than allowing it to manifest freely. The structure bristles with weapons, Tesla spheres that project arcing energy across wide areas, and the primary Tesseract projector that can open brief dimensional rifts to unleash focused bursts of Catan power. The Tesseract projector represents a more controlled application of Catan shard capabilities than the Tesseract vault's approach. Rather than weakening containment to allow the shard to act freely, the obelisk systems force the shard to channel its power through specific mechanisms. The shard has no choice in this. The containment technology compels it to provide power on demand, treating the fragment of a star god as nothing more than a sophisticated power source. This enforced servitude enrages the imprisoned shards, but they lack the strength to resist the containment systems, while simultaneously being forced to fuel the obelisk's weapons. The transcendent Catan represent the most dangerous manifestations of star god power that Necrons can deploy. These are not imprisoned shards, but the largest and most powerful fragments that survived the shattering, pieces of Catan that retain substantial portions of their original entity's capabilities and consciousness. A transcendent Catan is not truly free. Necron technology still constrains and directs it, but it possesses far more autonomy than the shards imprisoned in vaults or obelisks. These entities can manifest physical forms, towering constructs of energy and matter that stride across battlefields wielding powers that bend reality itself. The appearance of a transcendent Catan varies depending on which star god it originated from, but all share certain characteristics. They tower over even the largest war machines, their forms radiating energy across multiple spectrums. A transcendent Catan of the Nightbringer appears as a skeletal figure wreathed in darkness, its presence causing nearby enemies to experience primal terror. The Deceiver manifests in forms that shift and change, never quite appearing the same way twice, and projecting illusions that confuse enemy targeting systems. The Void Dragon takes shapes that suggest terrible mechanical beauty, its form incorporating geometric patterns that hint at its affinity for technology and material science. The powers wielded by Transcendent Catan operate on principles that ignore conventional physics. They can manipulate time within localized areas, causing enemy forces to experience temporal distortion that ages them centuries in seconds or traps them in temporal loops. They manipulate gravity, creating zones where the fundamental force increases to crushing intensity or reverses entirely to fling targets into the sky. They can alter the properties of matter itself, transmuting enemy armor into dust or causing weapons to malfunction as their molecular structure becomes unstable. These reality warping abilities make Transcendent Catan nearly impossible to engage through conventional military doctrine. Necron control over Transcendent Catan remains tenuous at best. These entities retain enough of their original power and consciousness to resist direct commands, and they harbor murderous hatred for the species that shattered them. The Necrons employ sophisticated control mechanisms, combinations of command protocols, containment technology, and direct threats to ensure compliance. A Transcendent Catan understands that the Necrons could shatter it further if it proves uncooperative, reducing it to smaller shards that would be imprisoned in Tesseract vaults. This threat provides motivation for cooperation, but it does not create loyalty or genuine obedience. The deployment of a Transcendent Catan represents a calculated gamble by Necron commanders. The entity will eliminate threats to Necron forces with devastating efficiency. Its reality warping powers destroying enemies that conventional weapons cannot effectively engage. However, the Transcendent Catan may interpret its objectives in ways that serve its own agenda rather than strict tactical requirements. It might eliminate enemies, but do so in ways that maximize suffering rather than military efficiency. It might pursue targets that it considers personally offensive rather than those that represent genuine tactical priorities. Necron overlords who deploy Transcendent Catan must maintain constant oversight, ready to reassert control if the entity begins acting contrary to strategic objectives. The combination of these war engines, monoliths serving as mobile fortresses and teleportation hubs, doomsday arcs and annihilation barges providing devastating firepower, and the terrible power of imprisoned Catan shards, gives Necron forces capabilities that few enemies can effectively counter. The self-repairing nature of Necron vehicles combined with their advanced weapons technology creates a combined arms force that can engage any target type. Infantry face Tesla weapons that chain through their formations and Gauss weapons that strip them to atoms. Armor encounters doomsday cannons that punch through the heaviest plating. Fortifications are reduced to rubble by sustained bombardment. And when conventional weapons prove insufficient, the Necrons can unleash the reality warping powers of Catan shards, accepting the risks inherent in deploying weapons that hate their wielders as much as their targets. The chronometers embedded in tomb world systems began registering their appointed times in the 41st millennium, triggering awakening protocols that had remained dormant for 60 million years. The process was not simultaneous. Tomb worlds across the galaxy activated according to their individual programming, some responding to astronomical alignments, others to detected energy signatures, and still others to the simple passage of predetermined time intervals. The stasis crypts opened, temporal fields collapsed, and Necron consciousness matrices reconnected with their necrodermis bodies. For the awakening Necrons, no time had passed. They had entered the crypts as the galaxy burned with the final conflicts of the wars in heaven, and they emerged to find themselves in an utterly transformed universe. The damage was immediately apparent. Pharaohs who had commanded intact dynasties before the Great Sleep awakened to discover vast portions of their forces simply gone. Entire sections of tomb complexes had collapsed during the millions of years of dormancy, crushing the stasis crypts within and destroying the Necrons they housed. Geological activity had breached other areas, flooding halls with magma or water that corroded necrodermis bodies beyond even living metal's capacity for self-repair. Some tomb worlds had drifted through space over the eons, their stars moving through the galaxy and carrying their planets into unfamiliar regions. These displaced dynasties awakened light years from their original territories, surrounded by stellar configurations they did not recognize. The cascade malfunctions that had occurred during the Great Sleep revealed themselves in horrifying detail. Warriors emerged from stasis with their consciousness matrices corrupted, their personality engrams degraded into fragments that could no longer support coherent thought. These damaged Necrons retained their combat programming and basic motor functions, but nothing of their original consciousness survived. They were automatons in the truest sense, sophisticated machines that mimicked life without possessing any genuine awareness. Lords and overlords discovered that substantial portions of their forces had been reduced to this state, their armies now composed largely of hollow shells that could follow orders, but demonstrated no capacity for independent action whatsoever. Other malfunctions manifested in more disturbing ways. Some Necrons awakened believing themselves still fighting the wars in heaven, their corrupted memories placing them in battles that had ended 60 million years ago. These confused warriors attacked their own kind, identifying fellow Necrons as Old One servants or Khatan forces, depending on how their damaged engrams had misinterpreted their situation. Overlords found themselves forced to destroy portions of their own forces, eliminating Necrons whose corrupted consciousness made them more dangerous to their dynasty than useful as soldiers. The realization that these destroyed warriors could not be replaced, that every loss was permanent, made these necessary cullings particularly bitter. The territories the dynasties had claimed before the Great Sleep no longer belonged to them. Younger races had spread across the galaxy during the Necrons' absence, establishing civilizations on worlds that Necron records identified as dynastic holdings. Human populations numbered in the quadrillions, spread across millions of worlds in an imperium that controlled vast swathes of the galaxy. The Eldari Empire that had dominated the galaxy for millions of years had collapsed, but their remnants still occupied significant territories and maintained access to the webway. The Orcs, devolved descendants of the Krork who had fought in the wars in heaven, infested thousands of systems, their crude but numerous forces presenting obstacles to Necron expansion. Pharaons who awakened with substantial portions of their dynasties intact faced strategic decisions that would determine their civilization's future. Some chose immediate military action, launching campaigns to reclaim territories that bore their dynasty's ancient markers. These aggressive nobles deployed their legions against the younger races who had settled on what they considered Necron worlds, their gauss weapons stripping away cities and populations with mechanical efficiency. The younger races resisted, of course. Humanity's Imperium responded to Necron incursions with guard regiments and Space Marine chapters, while Orc warbands attacked Necron forces with their characteristic enthusiasm for violence. The battles revealed both Necron advantages and limitations. The Undying Legions could sustain casualties that would break any organic army, their warriors reanimating from damage that would permanently eliminate conventional soldiers. Necron technology remained superior to most of what the younger races could deploy. Gauss weapons stripped through armor that could withstand bolter fire, and the self-repairing nature of Necron war machines made them extraordinarily difficult to permanently destroy. However, the younger races possessed numbers that the Necrons could not match. Every destroyed Necron warrior represented an irreplaceable loss, while the Imperium could raise new guard regiments, and the Orcs simply spawned more boys from their fungal spores. Other Pharaons adopted more cautious approaches, focusing on consolidating their remaining forces and assessing the strategic situation before committing to major campaigns. These conservative nobles recognized that the Necrons had awakened in a position of strategic weakness. Their dynasties were shadows of their former strength, their territories occupied, and their numbers reduced to fractions of what they had possessed before the Great Sleep, launching immediate wars of reconquest against enemies who could replace their losses, while the Necrons could not seem strategically unsound. These Pharaons established defensive perimeters around their tomb worlds, deployed reconnaissance forces to gather intelligence about the current galaxy, and began the slow process of repairing and reactivating as much of their remaining strength as possible. The Silent King's return complicated an already fractured situation. Zarek had spent 60 million years in the intergalactic void, traveling between galaxies and observing the universe from a perspective no other Necron possessed. What he discovered in those dark spaces between galaxies drove him back to the civilization he had abandoned. The Tyranids were coming. These extragalactic predators consumed all biomass in their path, stripping worlds of every organic molecule and leaving behind lifeless rocks. Zarek had witnessed entire galaxies fall to Tyranid hive fleets, had watched these biological horrors devour quadrillions of living beings, and incorporate their genetic material into ever more efficient killing machines. The implications for the Necrons were existential. The species had accepted biotransference and existence as undying consciousnesses in metal shells, with the implicit understanding that some solution might eventually be found. Necron Cryptek studied the problem of restoring consciousness to organic bodies, investigating whether the process that had stripped them of their flesh might somehow be reversed. This research assumed the availability of biological material to work with, populations of living beings whose genetic structures could be studied and potentially adapted for Necron use. The Tyranids threatened to eliminate that possibility entirely. If the hive fleets consumed all biomass in the galaxy, the Necrons would be trapped in their necrodermis shells forever, with no organic matter remaining to provide a path back to genuine life. Zarek attempted to unite the dynasties against this threat, traveling to awakened tomb worlds and presenting his evidence of the Tyranid menace. Some pharaons acknowledged the danger and agreed to coordinate their efforts against the hive fleets. These nobles recognized that the Tyranids represented a threat not just to Necron interests, but to their species' long-term survival. They deployed forces to intercept Tyranid hive fleets, engaging the biological horrors in battles that saw Necron warriors fighting against creatures that existed only to consume and reproduce. The Gauss weapons that stripped matter at the molecular level proved effective against Tyranid organisms, reducing the creatures to their component atoms, but the hive fleet's numbers seemed inexhaustible. Other pharaons rejected Zarek's authority entirely. The Silent King had dissolved the command protocols that once gave him absolute power over all Necrons, and he had abandoned his people to enter self-imposed exile. These nobles saw no reason to accept orders from a ruler who had abdicated his position millions of years ago. They pursued their own agendas, focusing on reclaiming their specific territories or settling ancient grudges with rival dynasties. Some pharaons viewed the Tyranid threat as exaggerated or irrelevant to their immediate concerns. The hive fleets were approaching from outside the galaxy, but they had not yet reached many Necron holdings. These short-sighted nobles prioritized immediate territorial gains over long-term strategic threats. The fractured nature of Necron unity became increasingly apparent as more tomb worlds awakened. Dynasties that had been rivals before the Great Sleep resumed their competitions, viewing other Necron forces as obstacles to their goals rather than potential allies. Ancient territorial disputes that predated biotransference resurfaced, with pharaons claiming the same worlds based on conflicting interpretations of borders established millions of years ago. Some conflicts turned violent, with Necron forces engaging each other in battles that accomplished nothing beyond reducing both sides' already depleted numbers. Warriors who had fought together against the Old Ones now stripped each other to atoms with Gauss fire over territorial claims that the younger races had rendered moot through 60 million years of occupation. The most pragmatic pharaons recognized that cooperation with younger races might serve Necron interests, at least temporarily. The Imperium of Man possessed vast armies and controlled significant territories. The Eldari retained knowledge and technology that could prove useful. Even the orcs, for all their primitive savagery, represented biomass that the Tyranids would target, potentially drawing hive fleet attention away from more strategically important worlds. These practical nobles approached younger race factions with offers of alliance or non-aggression, proposing temporary cooperation against mutual threats. These alliances were always temporary and transactional. The Necrons harbored no genuine goodwill toward the younger races. They viewed them as primitive upstarts who had occupied Necron territories during the dynasty's absence. However, some threats required combined efforts to address effectively. Necron forces fought alongside Imperial Guard regiments against Tyranid invasions, their Gauss weapons complementing human firepower to eliminate hive organisms. Necron Cryptek shared limited intelligence with Eldari Farseers about chaos incursions, recognizing that demonic manifestations threatened both species. These collaborations never extended beyond immediate tactical situations. and all parties understood that the alliances would dissolve once the mutual threat was eliminated. Other Necrons descended into madness, their damaged consciousness matrices unable to process the reality of their situation. These unfortunates awakened to discover that everything they had known was gone, their territories occupied, their dynasties reduced to fragments, their bodies trapped in metal shells that would never die and could never truly live. Some simply shut down, their consciousness retreating into dormancy as a defense against unbearable reality. Their necrodermis bodies stood motionless in tomb complexes, neither truly active nor properly in stasis, their awareness trapped in some twilight state between function and dormancy. Others manifested their madness through obsessive behavior patterns. Destroyer cults grew in number as damaged Necrons embraced nihilism and the extermination of all organic life as their sole purpose. These converts modified their bodies and joined existing destroyer formations, their corrupted consciousness finding purpose in the simple goal of killing everything that still lived. Some mad Necrons fixated on recreating past glories, attempting to rebuild their dynasties exactly as they had existed before biotransference, despite the impossibility of such restoration. They issued orders to warriors who no longer existed, conducted court ceremonies for nobles who had been destroyed during the Great Sleep, and maintained territorial claims over worlds they lacked the forces to actually control. The technological superiority that had once defined Necron civilization remained largely intact, but the knowledge to fully exploit that technology had suffered during the Great Sleep. Cryptechs awakened with their technical expertise preserved in their consciousness matrices, but many of the most knowledgeable had been lost to cascade malfunctions or destroyed tomb sections. The surviving cryptechs found themselves responsible for maintaining and operating technologies that even they did not fully understand. Some systems required repairs that exceeded their capabilities, forcing them to improvise solutions or simply accept reduced functionality. Other technologies had degraded during 60 million years of dormancy in ways that could not be easily remedied. The Necrons discovered that the galaxy itself had become more hostile during their absence. The warp had deteriorated further since the wars in heaven, the psychic dimension now dominated by 4 great powers whose influence extended into real space. These chaos gods viewed the Necrons with particular hatred. The undying legions possessed no souls for them to corrupt or consume, no psychic presence for them to manipulate. Demonic incursions into real space sometimes targeted Necron holdings specifically, with warp entities attempting to destroy tomb worlds or disrupt awakening protocols. The Necrons' lack of psychic presence made them immune to many demonic powers, but it also meant they could not effectively combat warp manifestations without resorting to purely physical weapons. The Imperium's expansion had placed human populations on numerous tomb worlds, establishing cities and industrial facilities above complexes where Necrons slept. These humans had no knowledge of what lay beneath their feet, viewing the occasional Necron artifacts they discovered as ancient xenotech of unknown origin. When tomb worlds with human populations began awakening, the results were catastrophic for the colonists. Necron forces emerged from underground complexes and systematically eliminated the surface populations, viewing them as squatters on dynastic territory. Entire hive cities were reduced to atoms by Gauss fire, their billions of inhabitants stripped away as Necrons reclaimed worlds they considered rightfully theirs. The Imperium responded to these attacks with typical human determination, deploying military forces to contested worlds and declaring the Necrons a major xenoform threat. Space Marine chapters received orders to engage Necron forces wherever encountered, their bolters and power weapons proving marginally more effective than standard guard equipment against necrodermis armor. The Adeptus Mechanicus took particular interest in Necron technology, viewing it as ancient xenotech that might yield insights into principles the Imperium had lost or never discovered. Tech priests attempted to recover Necron artifacts from battlefields, sometimes triggering tomb world defenses that killed entire expeditions. The Eldari recognized the Necrons immediately, their racial memory preserving knowledge of the species that had destroyed the old ones. The Craftworlds and the various Eldari factions responded differently to the Necron awakening based on their specific circumstances and philosophies. Some Craftworld seers recognized that the Necrons represented a potential bulwark against chaos. The undying legions could fight demons without risking corruption, and their territories denied the Chaos gods the souls they craved. Other Eldari viewed the Necrons as an existential threat that needed to be eliminated before the dynasties could fully restore their strength. These conflicting perspectives prevented any unified Eldari response to the Necron awakening. The Orcs responded to Necron forces with their characteristic enthusiasm for combat, viewing the undying legions as excellent opponents for a proper fight. Warbosses led their boys against Necron positions, their crude weapons surprisingly effective due to the Orcs' psychic gestalt that made their technology function better than it should. The Orcs' spore-based reproduction meant that any world where they fought Necrons would eventually develop an Orc population, creating ongoing conflicts that diverted Necron resources from other objectives. Some Necron overlords found themselves trapped in endless cycles of exterminating Orc infestations, only to have new warbands arrive or spawn from spores left by previous invasions. The awakening continued in waves throughout the 41st millennium, each new tomb world adding its forces to a galaxy already consumed by countless conflicts. Some dynasties emerged to find themselves in favorable positions, their tomb worlds intact, their territories relatively unoccupied, and their forces sufficient to begin reclamation campaigns. Others awakened to disaster, their dynasties shattered and their holdings completely overrun by younger races. The strategic situation varied wildly depending on which dynasty awakened where and in what condition. No two dynasties faced identical circumstances, and the lack of unified command meant that each pharaoh made decisions based on their specific situation rather than any coordinated Necron strategy. The galaxy the Necrons had awakened to bore almost no resemblance to the one they had left. The old ones were extinct, their civilization reduced to scattered ruins and artifacts. The Khatan were shattered and imprisoned, their fragments serving as weapons or power sources for the species that had once been their slaves. The younger races dominated territories that Necron records identified as dynastic holdings. Their primitive civilizations spreading across worlds, the Necrons had claimed millions of years before these species had even evolved. The Necrons found themselves strangers in a galaxy that had forgotten them, undying warriors emerging from tombs to discover that everything they had known was gone, and that their place in the universe would have to be reclaimed through force from species that had never heard of the Necron dynasties, until Gauss fire began stripping their cities to atoms. The Sodek dynasty emerged from the Great Sleep as the largest and most militarily powerful of all Necron dynasties, their tomb worlds concentrated in a region of space that had remained relatively stable during the 60 million years of dormancy. Pharaoh Imodic, the Stormlord, commands this dynasty from his throne world of Mandragora, his consciousness matrix having survived biotransference with exceptional clarity. Imodic retained not just his memories and tactical acumen, but something approaching genuine strategic vision, a capacity for long-term planning that most Necrons lost during their transformation into necrodermis shells. He awakened to discover substantial portions of his dynasty intact, with millions of warriors still functional, and his command structure largely preserved despite the inevitable losses from cascade malfunctions and geological damage. Imodic's strategic assessment of the 41st millennium led him to a conclusion that many other pharaohs rejected. The Necron dynasties needed to reunify under centralized authority if they were to reclaim their position as the galaxy's dominant civilization. The fractured state of Necron power benefited only their enemies. Individual dynasties pursuing their own territorial ambitions while ignoring or actively fighting other Necron forces was strategically inefficient and ultimately self-defeating. The younger races could be defeated, the Tyranid threat could be contained, and the galaxy could be reclaimed, but only if the Necrons operated as a unified civilization rather than competing factions. The Stormlord's approach to achieving this reunification relies on conquest and demonstration of overwhelming force. Necron Legions deploy across multiple sectors simultaneously, their campaigns coordinated to maximize territorial gains while minimizing losses. Emotic personally leads major operations, his tactical expertise and superior necrodermis body making him a formidable presence on any battlefield. He has destroyed Imperial Guard regiments, shattered Orc warbands, and eliminated rival Necron forces that refused to acknowledge Necron's supremacy. His forces employ the full spectrum of Necron military capabilities. Warrior phalanxes advance behind monolith support, Doomsday arcs eliminate hardened targets, and Lichguard formations strike at enemy command structures with surgical precision. The Necron dynasty's military doctrine emphasizes aggressive expansion coupled with efficient resource management. Emotic recognizes that every destroyed Necron warrior represents an irreplaceable loss, so his campaigns are planned to achieve maximum strategic gain for minimum casualties. He identifies worlds with minimal defenses or strategic value that outweighs their defensive strength, then deploys overwhelming force to secure them quickly. Once conquered, these worlds are fortified and integrated into Necron holdings, their resources exploited to support further expansion. The dynasty has reclaimed dozens of tomb worlds that belong to other dynasties, absorbing their surviving forces into Necron command structure, whether the conquered Necrons desired this or not. Other Pharaons view Emotic's reunification efforts with varying degrees of hostility and suspicion. Some recognize the strategic logic of his position and have voluntarily submitted to Necron authority, their dynasties becoming vassal states that maintain some autonomy while acknowledging Emotic's overall command. These allied dynasties benefit from Necron military support and coordination, their forces integrated into larger strategic operations that achieve objectives beyond what they could accomplish independently. Other Pharaons reject any subordination to another dynasty, viewing Emotic's ambitions as a threat to their sovereignty. These resistant nobles fortify their holdings against potential Necron aggression while pursuing their own territorial goals. The Stormlord has demonstrated willingness to destroy Necron forces that actively oppose his reunification efforts. Several minor dynasties that refused Necron authority and took hostile action against his forces were systematically eliminated, their tomb worlds invaded, and their pharaons destroyed. These campaigns serve dual purposes. They remove obstacles to reunification while demonstrating the consequences of opposing Necron power. Emotic broadcasts recordings of these victories to other dynasties, his message clear: submit to Necron leadership voluntarily or be conquered and absorbed by force. The approach has proven effective with smaller dynasties that lack the military strength to resist, though major dynasties with substantial forces remain defiant. The Nihilak dynasty occupies territories in the galactic east, their tomb worlds having suffered minimal damage during the Great Sleep due to favorable stellar conditions and geological stability. Pharaon Thodek the Silent commands this dynasty, his consciousness matrix intact enough to maintain sophisticated strategic thinking. The Nihilak awaken to discover their holdings remarkably well preserved, with tomb complexes functioning at near optimal capacity and warrior populations substantially intact compared to most dynasties. Their territories had remained largely unoccupied by younger races during the 60 million years of Necron dormancy, leaving the Nihilak in a position to simply resume control of worlds that still bore their ancient markers. This fortunate situation shaped Nihilak's strategic doctrine in ways that diverged sharply from aggressive dynasties like the Necron. The Nihilak have no interest in expanding their territories or conquering new worlds. They possess what they consider rightfully theirs, the territories they claimed before the Great Sleep, now reclaimed with minimal conflict. Pharaon Thodek's priority is defending these holdings against any intrusion, maintaining the territorial integrity of Nihilak space against all external threats. The dynasty has fortified its borders with defensive installations, deployed patrol fleets to monitor approaches to their territory, and established clear boundaries that they will defend with overwhelming force. The Nihilak response to border violations is immediate and disproportionate. Imperial survey ships that stray into Nihilak territory are destroyed without warning, their wreckage left drifting as a message to others. Orc warbands that attempt to raid Nihilak worlds are met with defensive forces that eliminate them to the last spore, then systematically sterilize the affected areas to prevent any possibility of orc reproduction. Ildari corsairs who thought to plunder Nihilak tomb worlds discover defensive systems that activate the moment they breach the outer boundaries. Canoptech constructs swarming from hidden positions to eliminate intruders before they can penetrate deeper into the complexes. This isolationist stance extends to other Necron dynasties. The Nihilak refuse to participate in Emodic's reunification efforts, viewing Sodic expansion as a threat to their autonomy. They have fortified their borders against potential Necron incursion as thoroughly as against younger race threats, deploying forces that would make any Sodic invasion prohibitively costly. Nihilak territory is clearly marked through beacon systems that broadcast warnings in multiple languages, informing all potential intruders that they are approaching Nihilak holdings and will be destroyed if they proceed. The dynasty maintains no diplomatic relations with other factions, Necron or otherwise, their policy being complete non-engagement except through military force against those who violate their borders. The perfectionist nature of Nihilak holdings reflects their dynasty's particular obsession. Their tomb worlds are maintained to standards that other dynasties cannot match, every system functioning at optimal capacity and every structure preserved in pristine condition. Canoptech constructs patrol constantly, repairing any damage and maintaining facilities that already function perfectly. The Nihilak have dedicated substantial resources to restoring their territories to exactly the state they existed in before the Great Sleep, reconstructing damaged installations and eliminating any trace of the younger race's presence during the Necron's absence. This commitment to preservation extends to their military forces. Nihilak warriors march in perfect formation, their necrodermis bodies polished to mirror brightness, their weapons maintained in flawless condition. The Nihilak dynasty's military capabilities focus entirely on defensive operations. They have no interest in projecting power beyond their borders or engaging in campaigns of conquest. However, within their territory, they command forces sufficient to repel any invasion. Defensive installations ring their tomb worlds, equipped with weapons that can engage targets from orbit to planetary surface. Monoliths serve as mobile fortresses that can rapidly deploy to threatened positions. Their eternity gates channeling reinforcements from deeper reserves. The Nihilak maintain substantial garrison forces on every world they control, ensuring that any incursion faces immediate response from local defenders while additional forces mobilize. The Nephrek dynasty distinguished itself through its cryptech's mastery of translocation technology, dimensional manipulation techniques that allow them to shift themselves and their forces through space in ways that other dynasties cannot replicate. This specialization emerged before biotransference, when Nephrek scientists developed dimensional displacement systems that could move objects through alternate dimensions rather than conventional space. The technology survived the Great Sleep intact, preserved in the consciousness matrices of Nephrek cryptechs who retain their technical knowledge. The dynasty has exploited this advantage aggressively since Awakening, using their translocation capabilities to conduct raids and operations that would be impossible for conventional forces. Nephrek warriors can shift between dimensions during combat, their forms becoming translucent and ghostly as they phase partially out of real space. This dimensional displacement makes them extraordinarily difficult to target. Weapons fire passes through their phased bodies without causing damage, while the Nephrek remain capable of affecting targets in normal space. A Nephrek warrior can walk through walls, ignore terrain obstacles, and position themselves in locations that should be physically inaccessible. The effect is temporary, requiring significant energy expenditure to maintain, but it provides tactical advantages that other Necron dynasties cannot match through conventional means. The Nephrek employ their translocation technology for rapid deployment and extraction of forces. A Nephrek raiding party can appear deep in enemy territory without any prior indication of their approach, having shifted through dimensional space to bypass conventional defenses entirely. They strike at targets of strategic or material value, eliminate defenders, and extract themselves before enemy reinforcements can respond. Imperial installations have been stripped of critical equipment by Nephrek raiders who appeared without warning, seized what they wanted, and vanished back into dimensional space before defenders could organize effective resistance. The unpredictability of these attacks makes defending against Nephrek incursions nearly impossible through conventional military doctrine. This raiding strategy serves multiple purposes for the Nephrek dynasty. They acquire resources and technology from other factions, supplementing their own capabilities with captured equipment and materials. The raids also serve to destabilize potential threats before they can organize against Nephrek interests. An imperial sector that suffers repeated Nephrek incursions finds its military capabilities degraded as critical installations are destroyed and supply lines disrupted. The psychological impact is significant. Defenders never know when or where the next attack will occur, creating constant tension and forcing them to spread their forces thin, attempting to guard multiple potential targets. The Nephrek dynasty's obsession with translocation technology extends beyond military applications. Their cryptechs continuously research improvements to dimensional displacement systems, seeking to extend the range and duration of translocation effects. Some Nephrek nobles have modified their necrodermis bodies to incorporate permanent translocation capabilities, allowing them to shift between dimensions at will rather than requiring external systems to enable the effect. These modified nobles flicker in and out of phase during combat, appearing solid for moments before becoming ghostly and intangible, their forms constantly shifting between real space and dimensional space. Other dynasties view the Nephrek with a mixture of envy and suspicion. The translocation technology provides capabilities that would benefit any Necron force, but the Nephrek guard their secrets carefully. They refuse to share their dimensional displacement techniques with other dynasties, viewing this knowledge as their primary strategic advantage. Several dynasties have attempted to capture Nephrek cryptechs to extract their technical knowledge, but these efforts have largely failed. The Nephrek simply translocate their captured personnel back to their own territory before interrogation can yield useful information. The few Nephrek systems that have been recovered from battlefields prove impossible to reverse engineer, their dimensional manipulation components incorporating principles that other cryptechs cannot replicate. The Zarekan dynasty holds unique significance among all Necron factions as the Silent King's own house, the bloodline from which Zarek himself originated. This dynasty's tomb worlds were scattered across multiple regions before the Great Sleep, their territories not concentrated like the Sodek or Nihilak holdings. The Zarekan awakening has been fragmented and incomplete, with different portions of the dynasty emerging at different times and in varying states of preservation. Some Zarekan tomb worlds awakened intact with substantial forces, while others suffered catastrophic damage during dormancy. The result is a dynasty that exists in pieces, its various elements operating semi-independently while maintaining nominal loyalty to Zarek's authority. The Silent King's return from intergalactic exile provided the Zarekan dynasty with leadership that most other dynasties lack. Zarek possesses strategic vision that extends beyond immediate territorial concerns or dynastic rivalries. His 60 million years observing the universe from outside the galaxy gave him perspective that even other pharaohs cannot match. He understands threats that most Necrons dismiss or ignore, particularly the Tyranid hive fleets approaching from beyond the galactic rim. The Silent King's warnings about these extragalactic predators have shaped Zarekan's strategic priorities in ways that distinguish them from other dynasties. The Zarekan dynasty's primary objective is researching methods to reverse biotransference, to restore Necron consciousness to organic bodies, and reclaim the capacity for genuine sensation and emotion that was lost millions of years ago. This goal drives Zarekan operations across multiple fronts. Their cryptechs study biological organisms from all species, seeking to understand the principles that separate living consciousness from the mechanical awareness that Necrons possess. They capture specimens from younger races, analyzing their genetic structures and neural architectures for insights that might inform reversal techniques. Zarekin forces sometimes conduct raids specifically to acquire biological samples or research materials, their objectives focused on scientific value rather than military gain. This research faces obstacles that may prove insurmountable. The essence that was consumed during biotransference, the vital spark that made Necrontyr consciousness more than mere information processing, was destroyed, fed to the Katan, and lost forever. No amount of biological research can restore what no longer exists. Zarek and Cryptex understand this fundamental problem, but they search for alternatives. Perhaps Necron consciousness could be transferred into cloned bodies, creating new organic shells that could house their awareness. Perhaps genetic manipulation could produce organisms sophisticated enough to support Necron consciousness matrices while providing genuine sensory experience. Perhaps some combination of biological and necrodermis components could bridge the gap between mechanical and organic existence. The Silent King's desperation regarding this research stems from his understanding of the Tyranid threat. If the hive fleets consume all biomass in the galaxy, the Necrons lose any possibility of ever reclaiming organic existence. They would be trapped in their necrodermis shells permanently, undying consciousnesses experiencing eternity without sensation or genuine emotion. Zarek views this potential future as damnation, an existence worse than any death. His strategic decisions prioritize preserving biological diversity in the galaxy, protecting younger race populations not out of altruism, but because those populations represent potential resources for biotransference reversal research. This creates situations where Zarekin forces defend younger races against Tyranid incursions, their Gauss weapons eliminating hive organisms to preserve human or other populations. Imperial commanders who find themselves fighting alongside Necron forces struggle to understand this apparent alliance, unaware that the Necrons are protecting them as one might protect valuable livestock. The Zarekin have no genuine concern for younger race welfare. They simply recognize that allowing the Tyranids to consume all biomass would eliminate their only hope of ever escaping their metal prisons. This calculated pragmatism drives Zarekin operations in ways that appear cooperative to outside observers, but serve purely selfish long-term objectives. The Zarekin dynasty's relationship with other Necron factions is complicated by Zarek's historical position as the Silent King. Some dynasties acknowledge his authority based on ancient oaths and cultural tradition, viewing him as the rightful supreme ruler of all Necrons regardless of his self-imposed exile. These loyal dynasties coordinate their operations with Zarekin's strategic objectives, contributing forces to anti-Tyranid campaigns and supporting biotransference reversal research. Other dynasties reject Zarek's authority entirely, pointing out that he dissolved the command protocols and abandoned his people millions of years ago. These rebellious nobles pursue their own agendas without regard for the Silent King's warnings or directives. Zarek does not attempt to reimpose absolute authority over all Necrons. He dissolved the command protocols deliberately, recognizing that the Necrons had suffered too long under imposed control, first from the Katan, then from the protocols themselves. The Silent King operates through persuasion and strategic coordination rather than compulsion, building alliances with dynasties that share his concerns about long-term Necron survival. He has shared intelligence about Tyranid capabilities and movements with pharaons willing to listen, demonstrating through tactical data why the hive fleets represent an existential threat. Some dynasties have been convinced and now contribute forces to anti-Tyranid operations. Others remain focused on immediate territorial concerns, viewing the Tyranid threat as distant and abstract compared to the younger races currently occupying their former holdings. The various Necron dynasties pursue their divergent agendas across a galaxy that grows increasingly hostile to all factions. The Sautek expand aggressively, their legions conquering territories and absorbing smaller dynasties into Emodic's growing empire. The Nihilak defend their perfectly preserved realm, destroying anything that approaches their borders regardless of origin or intent. The Nephrek conduct unpredictable raids, their translocation technology allowing them to strike anywhere before vanishing back into dimensional space. The Zarakan desperately research biotransference reversal while fighting to preserve the biological diversity that represents their only hope of escape from undying metal shells. Dozens of other dynasties pursue their own objectives, some coordinating with larger powers and others operating independently according to their pharaoh's specific ambitions and circumstances. The awakening continues as more tomb worlds activate their revival protocols, each emergence adding new variables to an already chaotic situation. Some dynasties awaken to favorable conditions and quickly establish themselves as regional powers. Others emerge from stasis to find themselves surrounded by hostile forces with no clear path to reclaiming their former territories. The strategic landscape shifts constantly as new Necron forces enter the broader conflicts consuming the galaxy. The younger races struggle to understand and respond to threats from a civilization they had never encountered before, their military doctrines developed for fighting each other proving inadequate against enemies who do not die permanently and wield technology that ignores conventional defenses. The Necrons have returned to a galaxy that forgot them, undying warriors emerging from 60 million years of sleep to discover that everything they knew is gone. Their territories are occupied, their empire is shattered, and their bodies are metal shells that will never feel warmth or cold, pleasure or pain. They are consciousness without genuine experience, awareness without sensation, immortal beings who cannot truly be said to live. Some dynasties seek to reclaim past glory through conquest, others defend what little remains of their holdings, and still others pursue desperate research into reversing the curse that transformed them into machines. The great powers that once ruled the galaxy have awakened to find themselves strangers in a universe that has moved on without them, their only certainty being that they will continue existing long after every current civilization has fallen to dust, eternal witnesses to a cosmos that they can observe but never again truly experience.